Hello, lords and ladies of the internet. It's I, the King of Candor, and welcome back to the Council of Candor, episode 16. Today, we're going to be talking about the differences in world building between sci-fi and fantasy. So, before we get started, let's go around the horn and meet some of our hosts. First up here is a friend of mine, Creatively Garbled. He is a fellow YouTuber. He hasn't been content for a while, but maybe if you guys bully him hard enough, we can get stuff. How you doing today, Garbled?
Yeah, why did you start with me first? I'm the newest person on the panel, and you started with me.
Well, Garbled, maybe if you made new content, he wouldn't have called on you first. But
I do it
That's
alphabetically,
fair.
by the way. That's why. So maybe change your name
Well,
to something
Garbled
like...
starts with a G, so I should be later.
Well, you're C, so...
actually, creatively starts with a C. So
Exactly.
get screwed.
Are you an English major? Are you telling me that I'm wrong?
Yes.
I'm telling you that C is the first letter of our
So
name.
Garbled
are
is
you actually an
actually
English
our
major?
second resident anime expert. He's watched the second most anime of anybody in this call. He also is an expert when it comes to Pokemon and little cup stuff, especially. If you're into that, he makes some great breakdowns.
Yeah,
of
nobody's
that.
gonna understand what that means.
Well, that's on you to explain, isn't
It's like
it?
you're speaking moon runes. You have a better time telling them what Skyrim information I know.
Look,
He
you
also
had me on
understands the
Pokemon,
entirety
you
of the
lost me on
companion's
the
quest line.
You're killing
No,
me,
I
Smith.
don't.
He's also
All right.
putting
That's
together
been memorized, in fact.
Yep.
cute little novel that I've
He
read
also
and reviewed.
has told me that today's his favorite day. He's also joining Hamas later. And that is everything for Garbled. So, moving on.
Wow.
You all know me. It is my channel. I am definitely looking to ruin it soon, apparently. And we're here to talk about some of my favorite topics. I love to piss off sci-fi people and fantasy people with this one. And next up is my
Hey,
friend...
good news,
Mr.
it's already working.
Yeah, Mr. Magic Goat or
I
Shadow.
can personally
How you doing,
attest to it.
Shadow?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm just here to talk about like mixing sci-fi and fantasy. The rest of the craziness that's going to ensue today is just pure comedy for me.
And I apologize quickly in advance. I have a little bit of an allergies today. I'm going to try to make sure that I remember to keep muting myself for the stream, but I apologize if anything comes through. It's been a terrible allergy attack. All right. Next up, and I'm not going to tell you why, even though his name is Dez, he's below Magic. You have to join the server to find out why. But Dez, would you like to give us a little information about your predicament?
I play some
Shit.
fantasy video games. I play some, sci-fi stuff. So, I mean, I'm
I think
familiar
the
with
audio's
both
not
types of
working
worlds.
again. Oh, wait, no, it's back again.
Awesome! I love that problem.
It's all right, it's back again.
Off to a hot start.
Okay.
This
You're
is
right.
going to be good.
Thank you,
Who's,
OBS,
who's-
for updating and rooting everything.
Very
as usual.
cool. Very cool, OBS. Thank you.
The audience.
After Mr. Dez, next up is my streaming partner, Nebula. We're streaming tonight afterwards with some Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah.
We're going to continue
Yeah,
our
time for
escapades.
fantasy after this.
Yeah.
Yes.
So would you like to tell
Murderous
us a little bit about your
escapades,
stuff?
hopefully. I play a lot of fantasy, and I break a lot of games.
In the last few nights, you've been grinding away in Persona. I know that much. Kicking that game's ass.
Persona 5 Strikers. Oh yeah, it's an amazing series. Can't wait to play more of it.
Next up is Mr. Pops. How you doing today, sir?
Pretty good. I got to play some basketball again today. We ran twos. I smoked these kids 16-4. They didn't have a chance. I mean, you literally can't guard me, bro. Like I'm that guy. Like I'm literally.
He was playing against children, though. Like when he says kids, he means like the local kindergarten varsity. So
Yeah.
Exactly.
you know,
Easy
But anyway.
target. They should have gotten better.
Because I do want a little bit focused, at least tangentially, towards this topic. I will say that I've been looking into a lot of kind of just research background stuff that you would want to know about the do's and don'ts of building these types of worlds. And I got to tell you, there are a lot of parallels that, like, initially I never noticed before, or at least like if I noticed them, I just didn't pay attention to them. I feel like a lot of the best stories in both sci-fi and fantasy, a lot of similar archetypes, parallels as far as the power dynamics of the world and everything. I don't want to get into specifics just yet because eventually we will. But I think this is going to be super interesting just to make comparisons and name a few different ways that they are similar, or what's good and what's bad in a given story. But yeah, as always, I'm excited to be here, and we'll get into it. Enough with the silliness before we derail everything. So,
All right.
all right.
And last but not least is our sci-fi expert here, Mr. Pag, who also has a new book out.
Oh, hi. Hey, yeah, I do have a new book out. It's called Scion of the Void. My pen name is Lex Henderson. So if you want to, Scion of the Void, Lex Henderson, go buy it. Funny enough, it's actually a fantasy novel. It is a low fantasy novel since it occurs in our. But there's still a lot of magic that goes around. So some of you guys might think it's high fantasy. We can talk about that later too. You gremlins.
Oh yes.
But yeah, so I have a bit of a unique perspective on this, given that I have written both science fiction and fantasy novels. I really love them both. When I was a kid, I started reading fantasy, and when I, became an adult, I started reading more science fiction. So, kind of loves the boths of them.
I would like to say links to both Nebula and Pag's book are in the description, so feel free to go down there and find them out. Also, go bully Astro and tell him quit his job so we can rejoin the podcast. We miss him.
Definitely bully Astro.
Wait, is that why he's not here?
That seems totally reasonable.
That's why Astro hasn't been on the last 5 podcasts.
But very unfortunate.
Imagine having a job and paying for things.
I know,
so
right?
true.
So, speaking of having a job, that's what tonight's going to be. Tonight's going to be a real difficult job because we have. How do I start this? We exist about 100 years after the origin of both of these genres. This is very important to remember. Whenever you're looking at like the fantasy and sci-fi space, as Pops briefly mentioned, they are really, really similar, especially the further back you go. In fact, if you go far enough back, they are the same thing, the fiction genre. It's not until about 100 years ago that some very clear distinctions start being made, and that we live in the evolution of that. So because you go back 100 years, you can see where it like split off evolutionarily, they feel completely different now. Even though when you go further back, they really, really have like two branches of the same tree. And I think we should start with a little bit of the similarities between the two of them to help show this off. Who would like to list a couple real quick?
All right, I got one because I know I mentioned it before when we were discussing the topic, and I just want to get out and say it. The quote, I forget who it was, but it was a quote somewhere that said, "A sufficient level of technology is indistinguishable from magic." And I feel like that really kind of opens your eyes to the way that both of those things can be used as part of a story. Like I was trying to figure, I always thought sci-fi was not really my space of interest because I'm not somebody who like knows mechanics and how things work and how a jetpack would work or anything. But I feel like at the same time, it's like a parallel to magic to have such high levels of tech and everything. And it's part of world building. It goes into whether you want to be hyper realistic and explain everything, or if you just want to tell people this is the world and we have this thing. I feel like there's different ways to approach it, but I never really saw it as such a a valid comparison until I started looking into it recently. So I think that's a good similarity.
Oh yeah, and I think something really important to remember is all of these stories are about the same thing. They're about the core of human experience. They are ways for you as a person these days to either have an escapist fantasy or to connect with your fellow man in a different way that you normally would expect or be able to do from just simply reading real historical things. History and like settings that are taking place in our own world have a lot of baggage behind them, and it's much more difficult for you to be able to see some of the nuances and other sides. But if instead of communists and Nazis, you have elves and dwarves, you can probably understand what's going on better. Maybe I could never sympathize with a fascist, but I look at the Klingons and understand a little bit more what's going on there. That really helps understand things and helps with a little bit of abstraction to get to the core of the human issue. That's something else I really want to mention early when I say just how closely related these two are.
I think it also, by approaching it that way, also opens you up to a bigger audience as far as what's available, because people thrust into a world where it's not the real world. It's totally imaginative. It's a different setting, different landscape, country, whatever, Middle Earth. You really kind of drop your biases when you're thrust into something where it's not you being invested or you've been taught something about in real life, because it's a totally different world. So I think I think it does open people up to new ideas if they just pay attention.
A couple of things too. It's the some of it is the difference between, oh, I teleported using the sci-fi tech, and I teleported because I had this level of magic. But to Pops's point with the countries thing, it's almost like doing history, but with like half of the baggage, because you don't have to start at like, you don't have 500 years of history. Like, you might have 500 years of history, but it's literally just unknowable because the writer like doesn't care enough to like doesn't want to write a story about like the like each 500 years. Where like if you're reading history, you can go back into like each of those 500 years and learn about like 500 different countries,
Consequential from what came before it in real life. Whereas with fictional
right,
worlds,
exactly.
you can make a definitive stop and start point of where things happened. Also,
Exactly.
something else I want to say is I want to point at Peg. He mentioned earlier he's written for sci-fi and fantasy. I find that's incredibly rare these days as a skill set online, but almost all of the best authors did that. George R.R. Martin, who's written for both, Brandon Sanderson's written for both. You see a lot of the older stuff with like Conan, a lot of the guys who, like Clark and all those guys wrote sci-fi and fantasy stories. You see C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia, wrote a Christian sci-fi horror novel that I really want to check out on the
really?
Yeah, I want to check it out with the book club one of these days.
That sounds fascinating.
Doesn't it?
Do you think
That's fascinating? I want to do. Yeah, now okay. That sounds really cool.
Doesn't it?
What's the
I
title
don't
of
know
this
how
novel?
it would be, but like that's fascinating.
you
What's
think
the
that's
title of this book?
the idea that they used to not have such a distinction between each other? Because I feel like a lot of the guys you mentioned, like it was a Tolkien, like obviously that was back in the day before we had like people saying I'm specifically a sci-fi writer. Like people started boxing themselves in more recently, but I feel like it's
Well,
again the themes and everything lend themselves.
part of it is I'd say it's probably was like a lot like the sci-fi and fantasy were a lot more like not almost the opposite of niche, where like because the like whole hobby of like reading those types of books probably was like less popular. I imagine that like you kind of like if you were writing for one, you're like there's no like it didn't really matter if you wrote for the other. Where nowadays, a lot of people want like, you know, typically you'll write a few books for the same series, and even then,
You
like,
garner a reputation.
you'll want to like expand the whole universe and stuff rather than like kind of jumping, universes or stories for
Pag, your thoughts? Because you're the only one who's done both genres. I mean,
Before we did, I want to answer his question. I'm pretty sure the book is actually called Out of the Silent Planet. It's it's the first book of a trilogy, and what's really interesting is this is a moment where C.S. Lewis actually gets to dunk on Tolkien because both of them made a bet that they could write better science fiction stories that were coming out, and Tolkien never got around to completing his time travel story, but C.S. Lewis managed to get an entire trilogy out that's still talked about today. Which is kind of nice that for once, the little guy gets a shot to say, look, Ma, I did it.
C.S. Lewis is a legend. Also a little bit underappreciated since those Narnia movies just didn't really hit. I feel like he should get more respect, especially as like the religious themes and everything. Like he worked hard to really put a message into his stuff. But anyway, yeah.
So something interesting about the author, like I totally agree with your point that the best ones they do both. Like all of the best ones, they write both. And that's not just tooting my own horn. I wouldn't say that I'm one of the best ones at all. I think I'm all right. But all the best ones do write both, and that's because, or at least something I've noticed, is that a lot of fantasy authors they write really good characters. A lot of the character work in fantasy is just much better than the stuff in science fiction. But a lot of the like ideas I think in science fiction are a little bit better, and they're better at explaining like concepts and things like that.
I agree,
and
I
so
think it's weird that that's the case.
Yeah. You think
yeah,
it's
I think
Why do you think it's weird?
Well, the reason I think it's weird is because fantasy authors have to spend so much more time establishing their universe and like selling it to you. Magic is a
actually
lot
disagree
harder
with
to
that.
understand than saying, "Hey, we advanced a little bit technologically," but they also get incredibly lazy because they just start taking shorthands, which is why they don't actually end up developing their world into meaningful ways. That's why Tolkien's Lord of the Rings stands out so much because his world is developed meaningfully. He took myths and wove them in. He took a lot of ideas, mysticism, and all the different ideas of Christianity and his worldview, and it wove into it really incredibly well. Just the idea of cycles and stories being important. Whereas most other fantasy things are just, I wanted dwarves and elves with big titties. They're like,
Shoot.
they give up there, and they're like,
You
Look
think-
at Japan.
well, Japan does a
You
lot.
think
But
that's
like, I
kinda-
think a more home example is actually J.K. Rowling. Great fantasy work as characters. Her characters are some of the best. Yeah, they have names like, Irish McCarbob, but like, other than that,
Hey,
when
you put
actually-
respect on his name. You put
Exactly.
respect on his name. He blew up an entire bridge and he
Amos
saved
Finnegan.
everybody.
Amos Finnegan, yes, he was very racist against the Irish.
Oh.
But that's his name.
Well, she also named the Chinese character Chow Chong, so it's not just
No way.
No.
Yeah.
But like,
Cho Chang.
yeah, it's a shame. But it's one of those things where, like, I don't think, her characters are they're great, but then the world falls apart because she took a lot of shorthands to get it to the feel. Whereas sci-fi authors say, no, my audience will not accept that. So they spend so much more time setting up their settings that they kind of forget that you're here for characters a lot of times because they're so focused on like the setting being fun to realize. And a lot of sci-fi books are really just an excuse to explore setting. Going off of the video I made recently, that's how Dinotopia is. The character work in Dinotopia is incredibly weak. I'm sorry, Dinotopia stands, it's true. But the world is really well done. And that's what inspired me to have this conversation here. Dinotopia is a fantasy setting written like a sci-fi setting. So that shows you right there a lot of the problems that a lot of these people have. And as Pag was getting into, that's, I think, the key difference to why these two branches have divulged so much more. That's also why more women tend to like fantasy and more men tend to like sci-fi when you look at the brackets. Not that the men are predominantly for both of them, but there are a lot more women in the fantasy genre than the sci-fi genre.
Another thing is that a lot of science fiction authors are kind of trying to get at a message. You'll see this a lot in Heinlein's novels. He usually doesn't do great characterization. There's almost always one character who's literally just Heinlein in this situation, just spouting off his ideas directly into your brain.
Speaking of,
Which,
like,
has its ups and downs.
Speaking of relatively realistic sci-fi, I think Michael Crichton did the same thing, especially with his last book that talked about climate change. Like the main character,
Yeah.
the POV character is like literally just like a regular guy learning about everything. And it almost feels like everyone is just kind of there to robotically tell him all the stats and stuff. And he's like, oh my goodness, are you kidding? And, it's still a
Yeah.
great book. I forget the name. It was State of Fear. State of Fear. It's a great book. Not his best, but yeah, good. I feel like he fell into that hole though with the messages he was trying to tell in a lot of books. But yeah, you see it. You can still be a great fucking writer doing that. But I feel like narrative and characters should probably come before the setting.
Do you think
Yeah,
having
it
a
just
POV
kind of
character...
depends.
Sorry, do you
What
think
about
having
having
a
a POV
POV character is very important to introduce people to your setting, or do you think that's more of a secondary thing?
I think
think
that's
it really-
entirely depend on the story.
It depends on
Yeah.
because you can have like kind of a removed narration, right, where you can go from person to person, describe their point of view, rather than having it follow a single character's view. I feel like you do that either way, though, regardless of setting. It's just kind of a choice.
I think one of the main factors that you're going to want to think about is how different your world actually is. Like how much are you like breaking expectations with your own world is like a major thing in deciding how and where you're going to position your point of view. Because if your world is very, very different than a lot of the things that you would expect as just a person on Earth today going into something, you're going to want a point of view of a character who is much, much more naive, who's going to need a lot of people spouting off data points about this and that to him. Whereas if your world is like a pulp novel, where it's 1950, and you're kind of doing like an investigation. You can have a character who's very experienced, and everybody understands what's going on. Everybody kind of knows what's happening in this thing. That's why when you read the old early pulp novels, kind of everyone's like mildly combat skilled, and everyone is kind of a little bit more dangerous, and that's because everyone was coming back from World War II. So it's just kind of expected that all of the men have a certain degree of combat skill and whatnot.
Sure.
So,
I feel like
I
it
just
also
wanna-
depends on it also depends on the scale to which the events of the story actually affect the whole world. Like you're not going to have to narrate some little extra thing about what's going on in China if you're writing a story about the Revolutionary War. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
And
I
I
feel
think
like
that on that point,
Well,
you
also-
could have hyper competent characters who still learn a new piece of information, and watching how they compare the old piece of information to the new information can inform you both about the world and about like the new thing they're learning. Great example is Supernatural. Every single episode of season 1, they encounter a monster that they've either never seen before or that has done something weird that throws them off a trail. So what that does is it allows you to understand when they say, "Oh, is this thing a ghost?" Okay, so you learn about a ghost and you say, here's how ghosts are dealt with. This thing's not a ghost. Oh, it's actually a demon. So now we have to shift on how do we deal with ghosts to how do we deal with demons. It's a completely different thing, but it relies on us saying the characters knowing how to deal with a ghost. And they just tell you, oh yeah, we deal with a ghost by hitting with iron and use a shotgun full of salt. That takes care of the ghost real quick, and you go burn the bones. So when they do all those things and it doesn't work, it allows you to understand as an audience member, oh, this is a new creature. This is a tulpa. Wow, what the hell is a tulpa? I don't know. They have to learn about it. But because the characters already know how to deal with a ghost, you as an audience member learn from watching them deal with the ghost normally because it's a basic concept, which is something that I think has lost a lot of fantasy things, especially a lot of isekais. And I do want to talk about isekais for a second because I feel like everybody thinks they're new when they're actually not. They are the laziest,
not.
shitbaggiest way to make a story. I hate isekais as a concept because what they are telling me as a reader is that, Mr. Reader, you're stupid. You cannot understand that another reality can exist. Therefore, we have to set you up here. That is why the first Chronicles of Narnia book and the first of the Thomas Covenant books, which, by the way, Lord Fowl's Bane, we're reading that for this week's a few weeks of the book club. Please come join for that.
It's pretty good.
Both of them
Suggest,
are
actually.
You've enjoyed it so far, right?
Yeah, I'm enjoying it a lot. The prose is very good. I am pretty surprised. I kind of went into this with a like, I don't know if I'm gonna dig this, but no, it's been a very enjoyable read thus far. I really love the way he describes his world. Would suggest Sir Thomas Covenant.
Yeah. And like I said, so when you're reading these old books, they're isekais. They have to they say you go from the real world into it. In fact, Lord of the Rings was supposed to be like that too, because originally they didn't trust the audience enough to understand fantasy. You exist now, like I said, 100 years after these things have been created. The audience is much smarter and more mature than they are these days. You can automatically understand that they have enough reality in their head that they can know this is a separate world from mine. We didn't know that back then. This is why when if you watch some really old movies, they would follow the camera from the characters between rooms because they didn't realize that you could make a jump cut and people would naturally assume time has passed. The first time they did that, the audience got mad because they didn't understand time had skipped. You had to train your audience to that. Now a jump cut or a wipe just tells you time has passed and you accept it without even having to be told that's what happened. First time you ever watch a movie, you don't be like, oh, wait a second. They were in their car. Now they're in their house. What happened here? No, does it occur to you? So as audiences mature, you can get away with more things, which is why sci-fi and fantasy have been able to split more, and you're able to just assume things naturally. That's why I hate isekai so much. They're just so
Don't
lazy in the
forget
way
the
they do
most
it.
I think
guy is Alice in Wonderland, by the
Yes,
way.
that's another
Yeah.
one.
Yep.
I will say one thing. I feel
Also,
like it's
very strange to hear you go so against the door into Summer Kid. Very bold.
That's not even really an isekai, actually.
No, dude, let me say, because I feel like it even contributes to the world building itself to have, like, from an audience perspective, you have a character interaction where it says like, oh, such and such guy is, fighting against the rebels, and somebody goes like, the rebels, what are you talking about? Like, they've never even heard of them. Like, it really helps the audience kind of understand the dynamics and who understands what and the perspective of each character, to have them just reveal as much as they do know, rather than spoon feeding it to the audience from like from a removed, like omnipotent narration. I feel like it's kind of more, it invests you more in a given character to really get inside of what they know.
I just want to point out something real quick. So Alex Gomez makes a very silly point. He says isekai is less fancy exploration and more wish fulfillment. I don't know how you could say that. It's just going into a new world where you're a loser in the real world, and then you go to this fantasy world, and then you're the best thing ever, and you have 12 women all fawning over you, and they're all basically supermodels. I don't see how that's wish fulfillment. You're gonna have to explain this to me.
So
like daily
true.
life walking down the street.
True.
Yeah, it's just
They do.
Exactly.
The thing is that isekai is like a whole ass genre, though. That's
At this point,
It's kind of a subsection. And the weird thing is, I think you can have it do either sci-fi or fantasy and have it work. But I think a lot of the problem now is just that a lot of writers get lazy with it. Of just like, I don't know, guy gets like shot in the back of the head, it's real suicide. And then he goes to this wonderful fantasy world, and we're not going to explain what magic is or anything like that. You have to go into the granular stuff.
Isekais give you a magic gun that basically is the protagonist, the guy who's in every freaking scene. He now has no clue what's going on, so he gets to ask every single question, which is one of those moments. So it's a free get out of jail. It's a get out of jail free card. We don't have to explain literally anything creatively because the main character could just ask the stupidest questions. Because he has no clue what's going on. He can literally say, "How do I breathe?" And that wouldn't be out of context because he's in a brand new reality. It's like, well, I guess that makes sense. He doesn't know how to breathe here because it's a brand new thing. It's so lazy, I hate it. And if you go back to the old stories,
work, but it doesn't because of the laziness of there's too many easy starting points to just be like, okay, I want to have this really cool mechanic in my setting, and I'm just going to have this guy who doesn't know anything about it just sort of like springboard into it.
Yep.
And that's, you look back at some of the older stories that are not like that are similar to isekai, but they're not real. Like C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The kids show up, and a couple things have to be explained to them. But like when Santa shows up and offers them weapons, they're not like, Santa Claus. Who is this Santa Claus? We should have Santa explain to us. They're like, what? Santa, you're here? And he's like, of course I'm here. Kids in Narnia deserve gifts too, don't they? And like, you're right, Santa. We're gonna get these weapons and kill the witch to help Jesus out. And you have to explain none of that because it's assumed what's going on there. Whereas isekais,
I don't think Narnia ever tells you that Aslan is Jesus directly. I mean,
they do. Pretty sure they do.
Do they mention
it?
They never use the word Aslan is Jesus, but they describe him with every word you could use to describe Jesus.
Yeah. Well, no, it's very obvious, but it's not like that direct. That's what I'm saying, though. That's the difference.
Well, Aslan, thanks for dying for our sins. It's really great that you're part of the Holy Trinity.
Man, I'm going to avenge Jesus because Santa gave me a gun for Christmas.
He just showed up and said, all right, kids, here's a bunch of weapons. Now go kill those lesser beings over there for Jesus. It's great.
Oh, yeah.
That's because you told me
They really adapted that well for the movie. And the animated series. Or not animated. The live-action BBC.
Old Testament God, dude.
Speaking of like world building and fantasy and sci-fi, I think one of the most interesting similarities between the two genres is the fact that the world building kind of starts at the same place. When you really think about it, a very interesting sci-fi or fantasy world does start with, here's something interesting that fundamentally changes how we would understand the world or a major part of the world. How does that affect things? Yes. And that's kind of my favorite part of world building, and I think that's part of why I like both sci-fi and fantasy so much, because they both get at the heart of that. It's just science fiction, at least when it's hard sci-fi, it's more of trying to think of something that could be. Fantasy, it's more of here's this magical thing and how it changes everything.
So you mean like realism?
I mean, it kind of depends because like the with fantasy, I don't think there's any time where fantasy where you don't have to kind of start from like the ground up with like, what's this world like? What's this culture and all this stuff. Where with sci-fi, there's degrees where you can kind of have like, oh, it's the modern day, but basically the modern day, but they have, I don't know, cybernetics or something like that. Like you can add like
Well,
one,
The first thing with
facet versus, kind of changing literally
sci-fi,
everything. I mean,
sci-fi
sci-fi can also have like that setting where it's
Yeah.
like, and everything is completely different now, basically. But
yeah, but you can
it's
see stuff
kind
like
of
Star
it's
Trek.
an option. Yeah,
I
like
feel
Star
like the
Trek.
big
Yeah.
level-
Yeah, Star Trek is literally just okay. So we have humans and everything. We solved all our problems locally because that's not what the story is about. It's just we took the modern day. We said we have space travel, and then we're good to just go.
Yeah. And that's what makes it interesting, though. And it's not necessarily realism. There are different degrees of like how in depth you're going to go like into that. But that's what I mean. Like that's a major similarity is that you're adding some type of spice that changes the world, that changes like either society or other things. Like even just adding monsters or like space fauna, for example. It really changes up like how logistics work, how like everything changes. Even if the author doesn't like bother to go too in depth into it, and and the author doesn't like completely change things to like consider that, it adds an interesting element for like when you think about it, when you start to like consider how it would be like to be in that world.
No,
Yeah,
I
it's
definitely
How in
agree.
depth do you?
Oh, 1 second. I want to call out Alex Gomez said a fantastic quote here. Sci-fi makes
Hey.
the improbable possible, and fantasy makes the impossible probable. Rod Sterling. Great quote, Alex. Thank you.
Shout out
That's
Alex.
a good one.
Nice job, man. No, I like that
Very
guy.
good
He's
quote.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I feel like two dynamics in both settings that kind of serve the same purpose is the fact that like every sci-fi story, I feel like it starts with like this is going on at 2250 AD. Like they always name the year and the level of exploration, obviously, that's implied at that point puts you in a whole new world. Versus in fantasy, they basically just plant you in a whole separate world with a whole separate, dynamics.
I
and
actually know
culture and
multiple great sci-fi works that don't do that. And there's one I want to point out first because I think this is there's something that Shadow wanted to bring up on the podcast, the mixing of sci-fi and fantasy. I think if you look at Jack Vance in the Dying Earth series, that's a really, really good thing to point at as to say, you poured sci-fi in my fantasy and my sci-fi here. Dying Earth is set in the future. And I think another thing, Dune, which is like the quintessential sci-fi work, is just in the future. When? The future. They don't
The
give you a
very
real date.
future.
I feel like Dune kind of parallel or it has overlap in both genres though.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's science fantasy,
Yeah,
but
but that-
people don't really just think about it too much.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that's the important thing to remember is these genres can be blended together really well, and that's because they work. They are from the same root source, and I think it's you can have some really cool fantasy worlds if you applied a sci-fi writer's lens to it. I think the worst explored setting in all of Dungeons and Dragons is Eberron. Eberron, by far, is the setting that D&D should have as its mainstream one. I understand Greyhawk is the original, and the Forgotten Realms is the one with all the weird sex stuff that sells, but Eberron is their best setting by far. It's the most unique.
So true.
And it actually, because
Yeah.
it takes the ideas of fantasy that you would expect to exist in there, and it asks the questions like a sci-fi author would of, what is the results? I don't like a couple things Eberron does, but that's personal preferences. That's not they did it wrong. I just don't like the way that they did this thing.
I don't like
It's all
this.
personal stuff. But like,
Yeah.
it's
I think
And it
Eberron is
really
a great
kinda is.
example of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Look at how unique. Remember, Eberron was a fan creation. It won and became like an official D&D setting because all these people realized, wow, this is so uniquely written. And I will argue that the only thing unique about Eberron is, besides a couple of equivalent details, is that they took a sci-fi author's writing style to fantasy. That's why it feels so different, because they said, why don't we go through things logically for a minute? And another great example of something like this is Arcanum, which is a fantastic game. That they took the ideas of, hey, What if we took magic and really put it in this world? How would this work? And can we what can we do? How can we bend it and pull it and mold it? Which is just, it bothers me because you'd expect that since so many people overlap between sci-fi and fantasy, that other people who wrote a lot of fantasy would have had this approach brought to them from their experiences writing sci-fi.
It's so funny that it takes like an audience who's well studied in it to kind of break into that and make it even a mainstream thing that anyone knows about. Because it's like instinctually you kind of see the parallels and how it works and everything, but for some fucking reason, the creators kind of I don't know. I mean, maybe they got tunnel vision or something, but you're absolutely right. It's one of those settings where it's like, yeah, of course. Like, why didn't we think of this?
Well, because fantasy is like basically set in the footsteps of Tolkien. Like,
and they're too scared to go
a whole
around.
lot. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's the
Yeah,
real
that's
problem.
the whole reason. All of fucking fantasy, like even the stuff that doesn't have elves and dwarves and whatnot, it's still kind of built in the same vein. Whereas everyone takes kind of a unique, generally, look at the view of, or look at the genre. Of course, they still have like gnomes and halflings and all that shit, but they're very, very different versions of all of that.
Not just that. The only thing I would argue is Planescape is the only other fantasy setting I've seen that comes close to that. And it's because Planescape says, hey, instead of focusing on the normal fantasy crap that we have now, we're just going to go smoke all the crack that we have, and we're going to design 1,000 different settings.
Hey.
Well, you go to Planescape and you'll realize, oh my god, they have a dimension made out of blenders. Why? Why do they have that? Because somebody thought it'd be funny. So instead of torturing people, they just open a button to the blender dimension and put people's nuts in it.
Morty, you opened the portal to the blender dimension, Morty.
Yeah.
No,
exactly.
But like
Planescape
that joke of Rick
is-
and Morty, that's from like the 90s in Planescape. That wasn't going on for decades where they're just like, yeah, welcome to hell. Why? We just threw people here because we thought it was funny.
Planescape is such a fantastic setting that gets underused, and even honestly, it kind of makes sense because it's hard to do low power stuff in Planescape most of the time. But having it be a location for a high level campaign is a lot of fun. And yeah, it's perfect. And also, I've seen a lot of adaptations in other games. Godbound is a popular game if you like high-powered play. And I've been in a Discord server before that was like a pick-up play Godbound game thing. And they had their own version of the Planescape city, but it was specifically for like deities. It was like a divine city realm that some of the gods put together when, they weren't in their realm. And you can really adapt that to pretty much anything and go on weird otherworldly adventures for literally anything.
Yeah, Planescape is really cool. Also for high levels, because your players are dirty munchkins and they will wreck worlds once they're high level. They will. They'll do it. And
we did that, remember?
You've done that a million times, yeah. The nice thing about Planescape is that you can just you're like, oh wow, this whole plane is burning down. Everybody's dying from this spell plague. What if we just, left?
That's the other nice thing about Planescape. The players can be horrible. They can do something that gets the entire world to try and smite them, and they can just leave. And if they just forget about it, in 50 levels or in 50 months or whatever, maybe people from that realm start coming after them. You can tell really fascinating stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, ironically, Planescape is more what people who play D&D want than Forgotten Realms. They don't want to play low-level stuff. I never see a lot of people excited to play low-level. I love low-level play. That's my favorite spot. But all the players that I see who are really into D&D, they want to be level 12 just to start the game, which is perfect for a Planescape setting.
I know Wizards, didn't they
what you have
setting of Magic a campaign setting for D&D? I feel like that setting would be good because it also has a lot of plane hopping, but I never hear anyone talking about it.
Well, they didn't really do that. They did the other thing. They made D&D into a realm in Magic. They went the other direction.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, they're all sort of interconnected, which kind of breaks it. Like kind of breaks a lot of stuff about Faerun, but whatever. I guess. Whatever. I guess.
Multiverses are very tricky.
It's money, baby.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Well,
money, baby. I'm just gonna imagine that the one in Magic is just completely like it. It's just a mirror plane because there's infinite planes, and so surely there's mirror planes, and that one just is, and you don't worry about it. And the regular one, you just don't worry about it either. Like just never the twain shall be, ever.
You're not ready.
Sometimes you have to be able to set.
Go ahead, Garbled.
You go first, kid.
Okay.
You go first, kid.
So you guys are not
Go
ready
first,
for this. You're not ready for the shenanigans that D&D's doing for the new edition. The
No,
villains
let him
on the
cook, let him
cover of the book are usually super important for what's going on in the setting at the time. For example, the villain on the cover of the DM's guide for 5th edition was Asarak. He's the guy who makes the Tomb of Horrors, that whole module that's super about killing people. And it was supposed to be because, hey, we're going to have like really high-powered adventures. We're going back to the classics. Compared to 4th edition. I know 5th edition is not that anymore, but when it came out, that was their goal, was to go back to more old-school style play, which did end up happening, because 5th edition is much more like 3rd edition than it is 4th edition, which it was true.
Yeah, for sure.
But you look at the cover now, and it's got 3 people on the cover. Hang on a second. I got a sneeze coming.
Oh, God.
Well,
Oh, God, it's coming.
Are the 3 people relevant, or?
I hope so. I haven't
going
even
to
seen the new
say
cover.
no, but I still want to know who they are and what they mean in the greater context of D&D.
Yeah, I feel like.
Sorry about that sneeze, guys. So yes, the 3 people on the cover are both the most relevant and interesting they've ever been, but also the most who the hell is this that has ever been. I actually don't remember the name of 2 of the people on the cover. Because I've been sneezing so much, my brain's a little bit rattled. I apologize in advance with that, guys. But Mr. Rex, who's a D&D YouTuber, did a fantastic video yesterday covering these people. The guy on the cover, which I'm going to see if I can get a picture of for chat, is called Venger. He's from the D&D cartoon.
Amazing.
What?
Oh my God, I'm
Excuse
so
me.
excited.
Deep.
Yeah.
The D&D cartoon?
Yes.
Run that by me again, Chief.
The D&D
when
cartoon
was
from
that
the
made?
70s with Dungeon Master, the guy in
From
the little
the
red robes that you see.
70s?
Yes.
No.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah. Yes, him.
Yeah, I know about that.
Why? Is he
Right,
a big thing?
So here's the thing. This is, spoilers for the cartoon, and this is really, really, really weird. We're going to get into why in a second. So, spoilers for the cartoon. If you haven't seen it, go watch it yourself. It's fine.
It's an isekai. I spoiled it.
It is an isekai.
Unless you haven't.
Wow, we're spoiling something from the 80s. Wow, kid. Couldn't even give them that much
70s.
time. Come on.
Hey,
What the hell?
Hey,
So,
70s?
yeah.
Okay,
So,
well, that's worse.
whenever it came out. It doesn't matter when it came out. The point is.
Whenever it came out.
Yeah, the point is, he is the Dungeon Master that you see in all the stuff. The guy in the little red robes, that's his dad. So he is trying to kill his dad to get the revenge on him. And his greatest rival in this setting is Tiamat. And this doesn't take place in any of the settings that D&D has. It's not Forgotten
it's just
Realms.
crack.
Huh?
It's just deranged crack nonsense.
Yeah, they made it up on the fly for the TV show. It takes place in its own place called The Realm. Not the Realms, not the Forgotten Realms, The Realm.
Yeah, that's where I live.
Hey, where are the Forgotten Realms? I don't think I've heard of them before.
Yeah,
Let's build a gate.
Well, they are forgotten, to be fair.
Exactly.
Put up a
So,
sign
They
that says
have,
the realm.
they have been forgotten. But yeah, just The Realm. And I'm trying to get this up on screen. 1 sec for everybody. I think it would be this. Boom.
The realm. Half-assed.
Yep, so here we go. Here's the picture of the 3 people. So it should show up in the live stream for the hosts. I'll shoot a post of it in the Backrooms Discord too, for you lovely ladies.
Backrooms? Oh no.
Lords of the Internet.
oh
What are
my
you talking
goodness.
about?
All right, there you guys
Oh,
go.
that's neat.
So yeah, that guy with the one horn, that's him.
Uh-huh.
That's Wenger.
It is very cool looking. I'll give them that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
neat.
he's
Yeah.
So his dad is Dungeon Master. We don't know if that horn is part of him or if it's his outfit. He worships and works with the evil. And
The evil.
We're just called the evil.
just the evil. I think it's got the shadow. Sometimes called the shadow. Sometimes the darkness. Sometimes the outer evil. But he works for the evil. That really cool dude who's got no shirt on in the middle helmet. That's a bounty hunter who also becomes his second in command. And I forget the chick, but she also works with him. So these are just like He-Man level villains. They just show up, they do terrible things, and leave. Now, he actually doesn't care about his dad, Dungeon Master, who represents good in this setting. Dungeon Master might cosmically be like good, and this guy might cosmically be evil, but they can't screw with each other. However, Tiamat's in this setting, and Tiamat represents nature, and the bad. And because Tiamat represents nature in this world, it ends up doing a lot of really weird stuff. So what happens is you can't kill Wenger unless you have good weapons and you have Tiamat helping you. So you have to have neutral and good, or nature and good helping you to kill the bad. And the bad guy wants to take his evil weapons and steal the main character's good weapons so he can use good and evil to kill Tiamat, who's nature. If they keep that trifecta going, that means that you're going to have a reality where there's good, there's the natural, and then there's evil. Good, neutral, evil are the only three alignments in the setting, which is completely weird considering D&D has the entirety of the law and chaos axis would be thrown out. These dudes also go to alternate realities all the time, to the point where
That's
you guys aren't ready for this.
You can't.
No, you're not ready for this next
All right, all right.
Wenger
Keep
says,
going.
I know. Because what happens in the setting is about like 5 kids get sent there, and they have to use weapons that the good guy gives them to fight evil. Wenger says, I need to stop these kids from being born. And like, there's a black kid, there's a white kid, all this. They're mixed up. So Wenger looks at them and says, I know what I need to do. He goes back in time, kidnaps a Nazi scientist, teaches him how to use Forgotten Realms magic so he can commit a Holocaust on the Americans to make sure the kids can't be born.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
The 70s really were a time we're in today.
They were a time.
Not
Mention.
time travel
my
as well.
God.
Time
I
travel
believe
is
it.
one of the things I am the most passionate about in writing. And no, you can't just go to the past and be like, but I'm going to rewrite the history.
It's not just time
That's not
travel.
how it works.
He jumped into our dimension and then traveled back in time to help the Nazis. There's so many other groups he could have helped. He could have helped the British stop America from being born and probably resulted in it. But no. This dude said, you know what? The Nazis. That's the guys I'm going to bet my horse on.
Yeah, let me.
Oh,
yeah,
boy.
I'm doing the bad.
The issue,
Bad after all.
I
will
will
say-
say a slight tangent about time travel real quick.
I'm
can't
doing
avoid
the option where the heroes have literally no moral qualms about defeating them.
Let me just mention something really quick. Tiamat is really popular for D&D right now because her modules were really popular and they sold really well. So before I couldn't see them doing this. I could see them doing this just as an excuse to make her more relevant.
That's what I'm saying. And like, this is the cover of the book. When you buy your Dungeon Master's Guide, this is what you see. And last time it was a Sarac who was telling you what's going on. This is going to, a Sarac also was set in the Forgotten Realms, so you know which was the default setting. This is just the realm. We don't know what the hell this setting is going to be. They also go to every setting in here. The D&D TV show, basically, imagine Planescape, but like, there's no rules. It's just utter chaos. They just teleport all over the place all the time.
I can't.
Oh
wait.
god, this is either going to be great or terrible, and I don't think there's any room for any in between. It's either going to be the height of D&D or like absolutely just a fat turd.
This
I'm
feels like
so
to me,
excited.
them taking the ideas of from Magic, where they have like 100 different realities that are all battling each other. That feels like what they're trying to set up in D&D.
Is this gonna actually be good? Is that what's happening?
I think
didn't
the
give a-
lore
I
is
didn't
going to be
care
good.
about it.
I don't know about the mechanics of 5.5.
Oh, no,
I
those
don't
are
know
gonna
about
be
the
terrible.
mechanics, but the lore might be cracked out in like a good way.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds if they're modeling it off of this, it sounds deranged and wild and like something new, which I'm interested in. One of the reasons I don't want to play 5e ever is it's just tutorial mode of 3.5. if they're doing something different, like completely different, like hey, maybe I'll pick that up. Like I would actually try it. I'd give it a whirl.
And I'd pick up the lore
and
books
they might
because
be
I
doing
just want
that.
to see what crazy shit they're gonna write.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
Like what the piss is going on right here.
Remember, they always only did like 10 episodes of the TV show, and they picked one of those episodes for the main guy to ally with Nazis. They've already hit peak in my book. They cannot go any further. Like, I don't know what else they could do. Like, you already had your main dude sign up with Hitler.
Yeah, where's the upward from this deranged nonsense you got going on?
And it's the funniest thing in the world because like everyone's always like, well, if you had a time machine, what would you do? I would go back in time and kill Hitler. And this guy said I would go back in time and recruit him.
What if wouldn't it be great if there's just like straight, like you're just going after like straight up Nazis in D&D now? Like that's the thing. It's just it's like Steins Gate, but specifically with
I
Nazis.
can see that. Fucking hell.
Go after like Pope Cthulhu modules. It'd be great. But no, it's even funnier.
Yeah.
So this guy, Vengar, he literally can't die. They throw him into a pool of acid, and seconds before he hits there, he teleports away because the dark powers that he made to deal with made it so he cannot die, which is also one of the reasons he wants to kill everybody else, so because he's tired of not being able to die. And the deal is he can't die until they're dead. So this guy literally has, like, the DM says no plot armor in a show where there's literally a dungeon master who interacts in the setting who just fixes everything for the players when they're too stupid to fix it themselves. And he's losing to his son, who also has the same powers, but evil. It's so wild.
That's how you ruin stakes in a story of just like, but I said
Perfect.
no.
Shut up. Shut up. It's perfect.
Yeah, it's hilarious for a thing a week. If you're doing a thing a week, this is actually
if it's
perfect.
very low stakes and it's very, I want to say almost popcorn entertainment. I'm just like, we're just here to have a good time. Like there are stakes,
If it's fun,
but it's not like this very serious, very gritty, very one man can change the whole world. It's like, okay, like it kind of works there, but now it's like, no, we're trying to be serious D&D stuff, and now we're doing that.
I don't know what you mean. This is very serious. The fact that
Very
he
serious.
just, whenever he's about to die, the universe itself goes, no.
Just exactly. Like you might say, okay, so it just kind of teleports him. No, it warps reality around him.
Dude.
Grand Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah, what does the universe say it does?
Right, Wizards of the Coast is fantastic.
This needs to be adapted.
But the thing, it's already a TV show. You can already go watch
It's
it.
very-
I think it's all free on YouTube too.
It's important. It's important for all those young men out there who want to be inspired to fight their dads, even though obviously he'll beat the shit out of you.
Early the hero of our time.
So
This is
real
the
quick,
D&D we
Kit,
deserve.
You had mentioned Magic the Gathering, yes?
Oh yeah, multiple times. But before we
I
move
want
off this,
to
do
bring
wanna-
that up for.
Well, before we move off this book cover, I do want to read an interview with the art director. Some stuff here. It's just really interesting to what they're saying. Because you may not notice, there's also a Draco Lich on this cover. So,
Come on, give it
go
to
with the
us.
theme that we have multiple layers of villains and monsters on this cover, from lowly skeletons or grunts that you may face often, emerging from the water, which is cut off in the image, I'm sorry. After a necromantic spells cast, to mid-level mini-bosses in classic characters, such as Skyla and Warduke, and Warduke's the guy I mentioned with the cool helmet, who've been featured in past editions, toys, and most recently in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight module. Buy it here now. Thank you for that. Up to an iconic level campaign villain in Vegner from the cartoon series, who's very capable of taking the spotlight himself. But of course, behind all of that, in classic D&D style, we have a Draco Lich, who may have been the mastermind from behind the scenes the whole time. We want this to be something that would let players see the options the book presents them. Yes, DMing is more than just monsters in combat, but really, that's just a fun part of being a DM. And in the back cover, we have a Mind Flayer temple with an adventuring party exploring a huge dungeon. We want to show that D&D is also about exploration. And he goes on to ramble for them. It's just, I really like the idea that that the cover shows like, here's how you set up an adventure. You fight skeletons, then you fight a big guy, then you fight a wizard, then you fight Satan, then you fight Super Satan. Because that's every D&D campaign what you need, boys.
That's right. That's called a writing roadmap. That's how you do it.
But Super Satan 3 Super Satan?
Yeah.
Let's go.
This is the best advice they've given DMs in the last, like, when was 3rd edition?
I know it's not.
Way
I
too
know
long.
Skyla's name threw me off
Yeah.
too. It's not the nice black lady from the comics who befriends the skinhead. I like that. We stand that Skylar. We don't stand this weird bitch on the cover here. We don't stand evil Skylar. What?
Evil Skylar. Wait, who's Evil Skylar?
The chick on this cover here.
Satan.
Comes out Satan,
oh,
Super
hang on.
Satan.
All right, my bad. Okay.
Super Satan, and then you have Super Duper Satan.
Exactly.
Yep.
Super.
Yep, Super Duper Satan. Now it's got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
yes, Garble. Now if you want to bring up... Go ahead.
So the reason why I wanted to bring up Magic specifically is because how their multiverse works until very recently, and I hate the change, was everything is its own plane, and besides a few very special gifted people, you cannot go between planes. And the reason why that works is because it doesn't mess up the economy, and I mean that unironically. Like, imagine, oh hey look, it's the horror plane where everything's supposed to be very terrible, but you can just sort of go to a place that's not that. That would be kind of stupid world building, and that's what they're currently doing. But before that, they had some really good ones. And the one that I think a lot of people would recognize in some fashion is the plane of Innistrad, which is the gothic horror plane. Do you guys have any experience with that, or...
Ravnica?
Ravnica is different. That one is the city of guilt. Innistrad is the gothic horror, where there is technically like 5 main dominating groups. I'm not sure how best to put it, but there are the humans, which are the cattle. There are the ghosts, which are just dead people who either can't move on or have so many lingering regrets that they take it back on the people themselves. There are the zombies, which are either naturally resurrected corpses or people Frankensteining them together into these grotesque shapes.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to probably get some.
So are they just like pests? Like they're just annoying?
No, all of these are like almost world-ending threats for humans, and that's sort of the gimmick of the plane. And there's a lot of other ones that I want to get to, and it depends on how much time we have. But the reason why I'm bringing these up, and there's also like the vampires and the werewolves and like everything else in the woods. We don't talk about Old Rust Stinkfingers. Don't worry about him. He's not a cryptid at all. But the reason why I'm bringing all of this up is that there's a very simple concept, but there's a lot of different angles that also are very dependent upon one another. So you have the color identity for Magic, which is white, blue, black, red, green, and you have the crossover between all of them, and it made a very cohesive world. So you have green and white, which represent the humans, which is sort of like the resistance of the main thing that needs to stay active on the plane. It's the humans, it's basic bitch.
Like,
well, it's all about like the expressive world building and how if you bring something in with a multiverse, it just sort of wrecks the entire balance, and you need to keep it self-contained and the economy itself.
Yeah, I can see that affecting that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I wanted to get to was with the vampires, because humans are hunted by ghosts, zombies, vampires, werewolves, and whatever cryptids are out in your backyard. And that presents a bit of a problem.
So
Humans
what
are almost
they
an
hunted
endangered
by?
species.
How far back does it go? Like, did humans evolve to be any different, or have they just been thrust into this world and have to kind of adapt their social life, or like, do they build things differently? I feel like there's a lot of potential.
Well, it's a lot more paranoia, but the one thing that gives them like the quote-unquote saving grace and makes the world function of just like, okay, so there's all of these different threats in the world. How are humans still living? Is that there was a vampire who came along and said, they're basically cattle and endangered species, so I'm going to make angels so that way they don't just die off. And it sort of makes this interesting dynamic of you need the humans to support the vampires, but the vampires need to be respectful of humans in some respects, so we add in angels. And it feels like a natural world-building consequence. And I feel like with the getting back to the D&D stuff of like the nuh-uh, it sort of breaks that sort of parody of like, oh, it's from the TV show, and we have I lost the plot. Shit.
It's all right. It's all right. I get what
Alright,
you're
bro,
saying.
that happens
Yeah, it's
sometimes.
Cases.
to have a world where humans are not regarded as an apex like species, like they're being manipulated to the extent that they're looked at as like livestock and everything. You do see that in a lot of. I feel like sci-fi does that more often,
Yep.
but you do
I'll
see
go
it
with The Matrix.
every so often. Yeah. Oh yeah, Matrix is probably the best example
So, and on that,
because it's.
well, I think it's about an hour into the show now. I think we should definitely start diving into the actual world building thing. So, what do you want to world build for either setting? How should you start that? And I think that this is why both of them, again, are thematically linked. For sci-fi authors, I tend to see them trying to world build like a story idea, whereas for fantasy people, they always seem to want to start with this setting. And I'm going to tell you right now, sci-fi authors are completely more correct on this. Stop building your fucking worlds. Nothing is more annoying when somebody tells me how great their setting is, and it's not something I can engage with. Unless you're designing a video game or a tabletop game, I don't care about your world. Stop telling me why I
Oh
should care
my
about it.
goodness.
Write a story and
You need to have
care
a
about it
vehicle.
that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, a story isn't about the world. A story, what you want to do when you world build in either of these, the major similarity here is what you want to do when you're world building is you need to start with the type of story you want to tell. You need to know what you're trying to tell people, and if you don't know what you're trying to tell people, then you're just going to kind of be flailing. So you need the story first, and then build out around the story that you want to build.
The only exception is for designing a game and you're starting mechanics first. That's the only time you start with a world instead of the story. If you say, hey, I have certain mechanical limitations or things I want to do. For example, if you're designing a D&D world, you probably should have luck be a key mechanic in it because so many things are down to luck in the dice roll. And you probably should make sure to include ways that magic works for whatever system you're running. Then from there, you can design the rest of the world to fit the actual setting and the way that the dice work. But if you're writing a story, start with the story because you need to figure out what you need to backdoor into it. I tell people all the time they have these complex kingdoms interweaving politics and these huge backstories, but the story is about like a farmer and his two buddies learning how to fight and become warriors in a small guild. Who cares about the demon fight from 5,000 years ago? Like,
Yeah.
I don't think it has to start like you don't have to start with the narrative and everything, but as far as what your priorities are, obviously with world building you have to establish mechanics and a minimal kind of background, power dynamics and everything, but your priorities when you're putting something together like that should always be the narrative first, right?
always
Yeah.
start with your narrative because your narrative will tell you. DMs are shitty novelists. You're right about that, Alfarius. And thank you, Gomez. I appreciate you, Alex. So I just bothers me to no end because they spend so much time world building, and then they tell me they're doing it for a story. Stop lying to me. Just tell me you like world building and you want to create a world. That's fine. Just do that.
I feel like it's a hole that you can fall into almost when you want to go back a millennium to like describe like the lineage of a kingdom or something.
Disease is a real thing, but like that's a separate hobby. If you just want to world build all day, there's a whole community of people all over Reddit. You can find Discords. Heck, I'm pretty sure Shadow here falls into this category who just like reading world building. That's fine. But stop asking me for story advice when you have no story written. There's about 6 people who I love them to death, but I want to throw them down a flight of stairs every time they talk to me because they ask me for story advice, so I get my writer's cap on, and really they're just telling me their world building. It's like, stop doing that. Yeah. Just write your damn story.
Start outlining a story right now, today.
Well, just as an example, for Star Wars, it's a pretty simple story. There's a guy who wants to go on an adventure and no longer be on this. He doesn't want to work on a farm. He wants to go out and do like more interesting stuff with his life, and that's the baseline. And then you get into Okay, but what if he's like a speeder pilot, and also there's his dad, and he wants to redeem him, and there's a lot more intrigue in the world, but it starts small. He's like, no, this is just this guy who's farming and wants a little bit more for himself.
It starts out with the narrative being like fairly simple, honestly, in episode 4 of Star Wars,
Yeah.
like as far as what happens, is the general hero's journey and everything, and then the setting almost is like, I feel like Star Wars is kind of like a typical, almost like fantasy hero's journey, just set with a sci-fi background.
Yeah.
Right?
To the point where Lucas had Joseph Campbell, who wrote wrote the book on heroes' journeys, on set during the filming to make sure it had it. Like, that's fine. So because Lucas did that, he specifically wrote things in a way that fit that. I promise you, if there wasn't a typical Merlin figure, like if he had used a different word, Joseph Campbell, to describe the Merlin figure, instead of saying he's Merlin, where he's kind of magical and he can cast stuff, the Force just wouldn't exist. I promise you it wouldn't exist. Instead, it would just, if you described it as the teacher or the mentor character, which is what we modern day would describe it as, then he would just be a really smart person. We wouldn't have Obi-Wan and the Force in this ancient mystical order. But because it was described that way, Lucas went in the back door and said, okay, what is a way that I can have a magic system that's very light on the setting? One that people can deny exists. One that people who are disconnected from it don't work. And one that is more dualistic than Christian. Even though the Force is not as dualistic as people think it is. But he wanted to put some of that themes into it. That's how you got the Force.
Yeah, because especially in the first, in episode 4, it's not, the powers aren't, super duper out there. That comes a lot from, the after films and the books and the comics, but in the first one, all there is Obi-Wan as a Force ghost, which isn't even being shown. He's just talking in Luke's ear. It's a mind trick and it's Force choke, I think.
Vader chokes somebody, but that's again, he's in front of him anyway.
Vader
could reach out and choke him if he wanted to.
Yeah, exactly.
But
it's but that's what I mean. It's 3
Well, it's
powers
also not
and
it's a fairly simple depiction of it too. It's just one guy doing it, and it's not until
that's
really,
what I mean. It's it's nothing super crazy, It's nothing the mind trick is the most impressive thing probably out of the talking from the dead's actually probably more.
That wasn't originally talking from the dead. That originally was just him remembering what he said. They retconned it though because they wanted to give Alec. Well, they wanted to give Guinness more roles because he was entitled to 3% of all profits from all Star Wars films. And Lucas was like, you're going to earn that fucking check, dude. So get your ass back over here.
But also, something I thought of. Do you think it's maybe damaged the way that people start creating new Star Wars stuff, even going back to the what is it, the sequel trilogy, episodes 1 through 3? Do you think it damaged their ability to kind of create a good world and a good narrative by the fact that some of the world building was a little simplistic, and the fact that it was mostly following a few people? Meanwhile, the scale affected first.
So
I feel like.
So I'll say yes.
I feel like
yes, it restricts you because you don't have all the freedom that you used to have. But no, because look at all the stories that were still told using that framework.
I was gonna say no because they still were able to do quite a bit, and because of the fact that they were able to. I mean, especially with the fact with the Emperor and who he was when they introduced him. They were able to explain a lot of how even though there's some grandiose powers and stuff, how the world broadly and it is a little screwy just because of how short the Empire reigns with around 20 years. But the fact that it's the fact that the Empire was able to wipe out the memory, and because the Emperor is the head Sith, and it's in his vested interest to wipe out the memory of the Jedi as much as possible. And I guess it is kind of helped also.
That's a bit of a failing later on because Lucas had the timeline a bit too tight. But the themes, the ideas, the setting, the way it was all done was not really a bad thing. It was not.
Oh no! Absolutely. Right, it's some of the details that became a little screwy later on.
Yeah, and you could have. Lucas could have fixed it.
It's
not that hard to fix.
I'm asking about the more recent stuff, to be honest.
Right, but
I feel
but the reason I want to bring it up,
two like gang groups, and everyone has a funky name, and like that's it.
So I think the problem is with the recent one is not that they're limited by the like constraints of the setting.
I wouldn't
It's
say
because
limited,
they're
yeah.
limited by being shit at their fucking jobs.
Yeah, because
It's
Well,
a
there's
lot
always-
different. Like the thing is about
'Cause I-
Star Wars, Star Wars is one of those settings where they world build and they explore the setting through the eyes of various protagonists. So you can just kind of yes and onto the Star Wars setting all the time, and that's how like half of their lore is created. It's just
it is.
yeah, just yes
Built
and
to
just
plan-
like oh yeah,
It's
this will
great.
be
I
good
love
way
it.
to
Like, cause yeah, it's like, okay, and start with this random Jedi or this random character, and it's like,
Yeah.
cool. Okay, what are they doing? And it's like, they're doing this, and it's like,
because
oh, this
Star
is a
Wars is so
completely different part of the
expansive,
world.
you can ruin a planet in your own little corner and nobody cares. You
Yep.
can go over there and make a
Mhm.
whole setting there and nobody cares.
Very easily.
And they'll
Yep.
just
Yeah.
they'll just say it got killed later on by somebody better if it really causes
Yep.
a problem. Oh, that whole species died of to kill that stupid species itis. Problem solved. So that you don't have to worry
Yeah.
about it. And then the real problem in Star Wars, and it's ironic, I think it's Robert Meyer Burnett brings this up a lot. The best way to be a storyteller is to consume stories. So you
Yeah.
have to consume non-Star Wars stories to write Star Wars. That's the only way you can bring fresh life and new ideas into it. The issue is all the people who are working on Star Wars grew up with Star Wars. They only read Star Wars. So now they can only clone Star Wars stories. They don't have any new ideas coming into the franchise. So because they can only write what they know, which is Star Wars stuff, they only write Star Wars stuff, which makes it stale because we've already seen it before, and because they don't want to change it or add anything new. Then the other people they bring in have never read any fantasy stuff before, so they just kind of throw what they know, which is political hack pieces and very short, stuff into it. So then you have that
Yeah,
problem,
and
which leads to
regurgitating.
itself.
Yeah, I was gonna say, but I was like, that only applies half the time, and then you said the second half. I'm like, yeah, that about covers the other half.
Yeah. So those are the only two people who are
Good
writing
artists
for Star
borrow,
Wars.
great
cover
artists
both of
steal.
them.
No, it's about like there's no shame in having somebody who's like a dweeb about it to have for like consultation, but yeah, you need to have people who are experienced in something that's related at least to telling a good story rather than not to get political, but you know the type of people I mean.
I
Yeah,
Not to get political. What the
think-
fuck is soil?
Hey yo,
yeah.
soil. That's not real.
All. Doesn't matter. Just if your whole job is to write politics, you're not going to be able to write a fictional work. I promise you. Go read Ben Shapiro's action book. It makes you want to It is
No.
Why would I read
Oh no.
he has a book.
Ben Shapiro has a fantasy book. Yeah.
He also had the
it's a modern American military
will-
book. I don't want to get into it. There's
Oh, that
weird-
one.
an excerpt from
I
it
do
just-
give
oh my
him,
gosh.
I do give him credit. He had the #1 rap song for like a month.
That's true.
They're true rappers.
It was terrible though. It made
Whatever.
me want to like cringe inside out.
So
Not
Alright,
not
but-
Alfarius does
I
point
wanna
out there
focus on
is
Star
also the
Wars.
line in the episode 4 that's it has the power to destroy a planet, which in that movie probably wasn't literal, but later on it very much was literal in several different ways.
Well, was
Yeah.
it shown?
Vader was talking about thematically just being able to nuke a planet will actually win you the hearts and minds of everything, whereas the Force can move
Right.
empires. Look what it did to the Jedi. Look what it did to set up the entire. It set up the whole empire. Killing a planet does not end a rebellion, but the Force totally could, because of the way you can manipulate and change things. But that's besides the point. Looking at Star Wars real quick, if you only read Star Wars content, you're not a real sci-fi person. You're just a Star Wars
No.
neat.
Right,
That will give
right,
you
right.
You're not
definitely
even
beneficial.
a sci-fi person at all. You're a science fantasy person. If there's a big
Yeah.
fucking
You just-
you just suck.
You just like Star Wars.
Right, but
That's
no,
all
I
it
think
is.
the difference means you suck because you should go out and read other things. And I'm going to point to a very, very easy example. Go read a book that has nothing to do with Star Wars, like something like Blood Meridian or any of McCarthy's
Like
work.
Lord of the Rings.
Well, no,
Don't
Lord of the
read
Rings is a
Blood
bit closer,
Meridian.
but hey, let me
Don't
finish this.
do it.
Go read something like McCarthy. It's not a fantasy novel at all. None of his stuff. Hang on a sec. None of his stuff is related to fantasy. It's all about the American West. You go read something like that. That should give you inspiration to realize. Hang on a sec. What if I told a story about a group of people on the frontiers? Maybe it's the way that they're dealing with it, the brutality of the war. You can take those concepts and themes and port them into Star Wars. You can't have raping and scalping and the judge, but you can tone it way down. You can have the idea of there's a conflict on a border planet that's so brutal they just say, bring me the heads or the helmets of enemy soldiers. You can have that type of story be told in Star Wars easily. Maybe the Mandalorians are the main people. Maybe the Mandalorians are the victims. I don't know. But you could start with that story kernel. And now you have an interesting setup. What if instead of you follow the guys from the story, you're following heroes tasked to go take those guys down? Now you got another great story. Or what if you pull from another one of his works, No Country for Old Men, where it's a drug deal gone wrong? That's such an easy setup for so many stories with the Hutts and the Narshadar cartels and all that stuff. Han Solo very easily could have been at the middle of No Country for Old Men, and yeah, you have to change the thematic elements for it, but the idea that that's a story that inspired you to tell something in Star Wars is great. Go read and consume all the other media out there, and it'll allow you, as a writer for Star Wars, to be reinforced and have fresh ideas to bring into Star Wars. Instead, they're just cloning themselves. If it's a copy of a copy, which is a copy of a copy, it starts to get this blandification of everything. That's why the Clone Wars TV show kind of sucks, because it's written by people who only want to write Star Wars stuff, ripping off other Star Wars stuff. Then you have a whole generation of people grow up on that, and now they're writing the current Disney content. So people who copied Clone Wars, which is a copy of Star Wars, which is a copy of other sci-fi stuff, it's going to get bland as it goes down. The copy machine's out of freaking ink.
Yeah, bro, go get your dog. Go get your dog.
Just like make sure your dog a little bit.
Take a deep breath and get the dog.
To bounce off of that you made when you said Han Solo, actually reminded me of the Han Solo trilogy. And the first book of the Han Solo trilogy is just him. You know, he's in this basically street gang where like he's begging for money, and then he breaks away and joins up with not the Hutt cartel, but it's like cousins of the Hutts who work for some of the Hutts. But like he basically runs spice for them, and like you learn about like one of the main characters is his co-pilot who he's lying to because he can't tell him about like his true past. And then one of the other main characters is this girl he falls in love with, where it's some girl who's like making the spice. So like you get a lot of details of like how is the spice being made? What are the conditions of like
that's
the
one
slaves
of
that are working on it? So
the fact that
it's got
you can I love it's because again it plays into the fact that narrative comes first. That's something where it's a very contained story. Like he's not affecting the empire or anything, but the setting technically
that too.
Like
the first book has nothing about the Empire. It has nothing about the Jedi. Like the most the Empire I think comes up is Han saying like, yeah, one day I would love to be an Imperial. Like that is my dream job. It would be to fly for the Empire. That would be great. But like, do we ever see the Empire? It's like, no, we only see the Hutts, like the drug cartel that he's working for.
Right. That's kind of where I'm torn as far as like the extensive world building goes, because I love stories that are based on like a very complex world with a lot of history and, you know, big political issues and everything. And then taking that and putting it from the perspective of like just a regular low class dude like that. So like I love people that can put those narratives together, but you got to be careful, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, I think there's several great comics, and maybe, I don't know about too many books, because like most of the books will either focus on like someone who isn't important, or like isn't important but is like there's always usually someone important in one of the books.
Well, those are still the type of stories that I like, though. Like
there's definitely there's a lot of books and comics though that do have from Star Wars specifically in the old EU that were like very, you know, they might not focus on the biggest thing. They would take the time occasionally to be like, here's what this random Joe Schmo, you know, like kind of, or like average clone trooper or average.
It's a personal preference, but I like those types of things.
Yeah. And I think that you could go ahead, Matthew.
I mean, it expands the world building great.
Well, you go on.
Well, I was going to say that, you know, taking this idea, you can apply this to both sci-fi and fantasy world building. You don't have to explore everything from Aragorn's perspective for Lord of the Rings. The reason it works so well is because the hobbits are the lowest among them. They're just average people. We see their perspectives and such on situations too. You could take that. Imagine some of the peasants in Helm's Deep. You could write a short story very easily about them and how they feel about the situation, or one of the knights who go out for Gondor who have to defend the walls as they're being sieged by Sauron for the first time. So you could have stories of these people throughout the times and the ages, exploring these situations and dealing with the ramifications, just like a sci-fi work usually explores that.
For sure.
I feel like you need to determine the scope of where you want the story to go, and it changes a lot of how the world building is.
Yeah.
Like if you have a story about, hello, this is a clone trooper on some random backwater planet that has no relation to Luke Skywalker, it's going to work very differently from the original trilogy or anything related to it.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I guess, Pops, the best example would be one of my favorite comics, period, is the KOTOR comics, where, like, it focuses on this Jedi who, like, he's not even a Jedi. He's a Padawan. He's really crappy at being a Jedi. He's like, dude, I'm not going to be a Jedi. They're about to kick me out. Like, this sucks. And then, like, he gets framed for, like, the killing of his class, and it's like, while this is happening, the Mandalorian Wars are happening, but that's in the background. Like, occasionally something with the Mandalorian Wars will happen, and occasionally you'll see one of the big players like Malik or Revan, but, like, does he fight in the Mandalorian Wars? Like, no. That only happens in, like, the sequel comic. Like, he stays out of all of that. And, like, you know, the bigger people on the stage, relatively speaking, will talk about it, but he doesn't deal with it, like, almost ever. Like, there's a specific, like, if it happens to him. He's not, like, initiating it type of thing. Like, he's not going out and being like, oh, I need to find out the Mandalorians who are invading the place. It's more like, oh, shoot, the Mandalorians are here. Time to bounce.
It's not
like,
relevant.
Or something like that.
Yeah. It's like a little background political thing that he just kind of has in the back of his head until it directly affects him. Now, I really like stories that can do that, but like I said, it's just a personal preference.
No,
thing.
It's definitely a personal preference. But
I don't know. I just feel like those types of stories are more engaging for me personally. But there's a way to do it where obviously you should probably follow a main narrative and establish the way that the world is affected over a given period of time before you start things like,
definitely. Because, like, the KOTOR comic would fall apart if there wasn't already the Tales of the Jedi comics, if there wasn't the KOTOR games. Like, if those three things didn't exist, like, it would make no sense to have the KOTOR comics, because it's very heavily relying
like further on the designing a world, though. That's way more advanced stuff.
Right.
This is when your setting is fully matured and you kind of have the ability.
Exactly. It's when it's matured, because like
when you're designing your setting from the ground up, though, which is one of the things I think people would tune in to ask for. These are questions that you don't need to answer. I'll tell you that right now.
Oh yeah, this is definitely much later.
This is stuff that will come out.
Because, like I said,
these are things that you can come out of your world building after you've naturally developed it once. Get that first story set up. Get that first story done. Don't screw yourself, though. Don't make it so it's so restrictive that you can never tell the story here, like you blow up the world at the end of the story. Don't do that unless you want to. If you want to tell more stories here, know that going forward. But you can aim your scope much easier. Once your first story is pretty much written, you'll probably have ideas for how the setting can go, and then you can go back during the editing process and maybe include a hint here, a hint there. Both of these things, by the way, are good for sci-fi or fantasy world building and setting. You can set up stuff. You can slowly layer things out. You don't need to have all the answers right now. You could just have a name that's a placeholder for something else later. Very frequently when I see stories, whenever you look at authors, they say, hey, like Brandon Sanderson's famous for this. One of his early stories he was telling is, when I was reading Elantris, I had a thing where it was like, this is the Illuminated. I had no clue what the Illuminated were outside of being vaguely angelic. They were not the focus of the story, and they only show up, according to the story, at the end of the ages. I knew that this was going to be a trilogy, and that the third book would deal with them. So what did I not do in the first book? Spend time explaining them. Outside of one character making a comment about a girl who's beautiful, and she reminded him of the Illuminated, which gives you the themes and ideas that are vaguely angelic. That's all you have to do. You don't need to have this whole world-building Bible done with all the, what food do they eat in Katapesh? No, screw that noise. Just
Yeah.
focus on what's important for here.
When you brought up
Yeah.
the isekai, I was like, yeah, you don't need to spoon feed every little detail. Give people what they need to know, and they'll know. Don't worry. You know, not everyone is going to have to be spoon fed. But oh shoot.
Something interesting about like this method of world building is that this is how the like Mad Max world building has always worked, like through the entire series. They just kind of have things going on, and you just kind of have to just take that all in, because the story isn't really about the things outside of Max doing Max things. That's all there is.
Because they
Yeah,
literally
yeah.
they open up right away with you being like hit in the face with 10 different things, and it's
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's just stuff going
Because-
on, and so you just kind of have to, go with the flow, and I think that's
Yep.
one of the best ways to like actually do exposition, is you do exposition as the character interacts with them, like you were saying earlier, Pops, with the dialogue of other people explaining only what they know to the protagonist. I mean,
Yes.
the protagonist can only get explanations of what they know, and you're riding on the protagonist's shoulders, so.
That's what I thought before, because you were saying, I forget, I think it was back when we were talking about isekai like settings, when you said like a main character can ask the dumbest, stupidest, like, why would you ask this type of questions? It almost feels like a game where literally you can just select a thing and they'll just be like, oh, well, such and such rules the kingdom of blah 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 blah. You know, like it's I feel like you get more invested in the world when you bring it down to what the character itself that you're seeing is aware of themselves, rather than having some omnipotent voice just dump it on you. But that's
Yeah,
just
but
me.
not having a character who's so removed from everything that they're useless. That's another problem that I see in a lot of settings, where characters who should know what the hell's going on have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, that's a pretty common trope to like get the audience to like.
It's a weird line.
Again, it's like look at a great example. You never have to explain to Luke in Star Wars how spaceships work. Shut up, they just work. Luke never has to be explained. He uses joystick here, uses yoke here. There's never a moment where he has to have somebody tell him that R2 needs to be in the back of his ship. He knows R2's there to help with computing stuff. Why? It doesn't matter. R2's there. Luke would know that. Another character could ask that question if you wanted to get into it, but Luke doesn't need to know. But what does Luke not know? The Force. So we spend time with Luke asking questions about that so we can explore that. Because that's the unique part of the Star Wars setting. Plenty of things have spaceships. Plenty of people know how planes work. We crashed a bunch of them 30 years before this film came out to kill the Nazis. So people know how this shit happens. But now...
And it also builds character.
Yeah, but now Luke needs the Force explained to him because the audience is explained to him. So you go off of that. Sci-fi settings, and fantasy settings could learn a lot from this and do that too. You need to have the characters asking the questions that are relevant and the relevant characters asking that questions. People who should know stuff when they ask stupid questions really takes you out of it. Because if you have a mechanic asking somebody else how a droid works, you're going to be like, wait, what the hell's going on here? That's why I said isekais are like a cheat code, because your main character is so stupid and not related that he has to ask all the questions. But that ends up being a bit of a crutch because you get no characterization. They're just bland. They just sit there and they don't do anything. Whereas other characters can really engage with things. This is why a lot of sci-fi characters feel so much blander than fantasy people, because sci-fi people, when they write their stuff, often are trying to get off ideas, and the characters are more mouthpieces for the ideas. Whereas fantasy people don't really want you to dig into their ideas. No, you can't see how the magic works because that would ruin the fantasy. Therefore, the characters have to be good enough to kind of distract you from the world building. That's what happens in J.K. Rowling stuff. I know I mentioned her already, but it's just a great example to point to. You're not thinking about how magic works in Harry Potter at the time. You're just saying, oh yeah, that they said some funky words and a spell happened. Sure, that makes sense. You don't realize that all she said was, in Latin, "Flonium Uppium." Like, okay, that's kind of funny, but why are some of the words in Latin and then some of them are in Celtic and some of them are in Greek, and it's a complete random mismatch, and all the spells are horribly stupid. And then you have Avada Kedavra, which is just abracadabra said weird. It's the magic system makes no damn sense, but nobody talks about that. Nobody brings that up. Not a single person, even Hermione, the smart person who knows 12 languages canonically, mentions how weird it is that it's just a bunch of weird languages. because that's not important. Instead, we focus on
Yeah.
the characters, their interactions. Whereas a sci-fi person
Oh.
would have Hermione constantly telling everybody what's going on. Oh, this spell is invented by Nicholas Virgilus, the Greek scholar from the year 1443. It's like, okay, but like I don't care about
He
you,
was
Hermione.
best friends
You're
with
just annoying.
Aristotle.
Yeah.
I feel like, dude, let me just say one thing, because I also feel like, regardless of the setting, even if it's a narrative in a video game or a story you're writing or whatever, the fact that like your POV guy only learns so much at one time, it also helps with like pacing, putting things to scale, like the kind of the stakes that are established. Also, it helps a lot with that and kind of like helping escalate, to a higher fucking whatever the word is, I don't know, but yeah, like you always said, J.K. Rowling, good with characterization, but I got to tell you, when you look from book 5 back to book 4, it's like, why don't they just? It's like it's frustrating almost. But yeah, I read all of them. I think what.
And that's a
Uh,
critical pitfall of like yes and storytelling, is you start to get muddled up. If you're not planned beforehand, you get muddled up. Which happens pretty frequently. Like if you look at like the Warhammer books, that's a key like example of just kind of adding things on as you go. And so you have some weird shit going on in 40K now and then.
When you make a setting and you're like adding tons of different things and having interesting things, there gets to a point where you have to ask yourself, should I stop adding things?
Isn't that where you get sucked into world building syndrome? Or but what was it you said
Yes, where
before?
you
World.
keep on adding things and you have to like rewrite a chunk of your world to make sense.
Yeah, because it
That's a
almost
big
feels
world
like
Star
building.
Wars had to deal with that a lot for
'cause your
obvious reasons as it went on. Like,
your focus ends up being like justifying what the characters do, when in the meantime it should have been like, establish what they do before in the story or narrative, and then build the world as less of a priority. But instead, now you've established something that's whatever, and you say, oh, we actually can't do this, even though had it in mind, but you got to backtrack and everything. It's like it becomes frustrating. So it's a thing to look out for, I would say.
You have to make
Hey,
it sort of iterative of the story informs the world and the world informs the story, kind of.
It's it's a difficult line to trot, I would say, but
Yeah.
it's a problem that gets harder and harder the more you have. I mean, like, because at some
Yeah.
point, like, it
And
All the puzzle pieces need to fit. And if it
yeah,
does not fit,
yeah,
I think
and
that
if you have too expansive a world, like, you're not gonna have people. You're almost certainly. I'm sure there's one guy who's made some super expansive world, and it like all connects. But if you have like, if your universe goes on for a while, it's going to have like retcons where like someone else writes it and just completely screws up something else just because they haven't read whatever or they don't know whatever for one reason or another.
unfortunately, yeah, but I would say that also plays into the idea that I don't know. I tried to bring it up in the beginning of the podcast when I was first introducing myself. The idea that like you don't need to have a sci-fi setting where every single detail of like how technology works is explained and everything, because I feel like that can only lead to issues later on. Like if you just establish that things are the way that they are, you could still make a great story.
well, this all depends again on the type of story you're trying to tell. And
Hmm.
if you're trying to tell a hard science fiction story, then that's important. I mean,
Okay.
like Blind Sight would be a much different book if Peter Watts had just written the book and just been like, "This is how everything is," rather than making everything like tightly constrained into what is theoretically possible.
That does
At
appeal
least
to me.
his view.
So, but,
Yeah, and
I
that's the
would.
thing. Some people really like the hard sci-fi stuff, like The Expanse. People really love The Expanse,
Yep.
and The Expanse is pretty hard sci-fi. But what you're talking about is more soft science fiction. It's stuff where you can just kind of add in what you want. And the problem with soft science fiction is eventually you just start writing science fantasy. Once you get soft enough, you're just you might as well literally just have magic at a certain.
Star Trek is the lower limit. Like Star Trek is just hard enough, and it has just a little enough magic that it doesn't fall into full science fantasy. But it's very, very. Sometimes it goes into it, but it very closely rides that line. Where I'd say something like Stargate, even though Stargate has more outwardly magical things, it's almost all actually technology, which makes it a little bit harder sci-fi than Star Trek.
I mean, like, I think we talked about it, what was it, last week? Or when was the Mass Effect? The Mass Effect one kind of, like, exposed that, like, you know, you go soft enough on the science. It's basically magic, you know? So.
And nothing is inherently wrong with science fantasy. Science fantasy is a very cool genre. Right. But the problem is people write science fantasy without intending to.
Yeah, that's what Pat's saying. It's essentially like you don't want to dig yourself into a hole to the point where you become like you transform your genre accidentally because you have no other choice, going from sci-fi into, you know, a little bit more ridiculous where it becomes fantastical. Right. So I don't know. There's a
well, let's say the audience is also different. Something you got to remember is, you know, unless you're making a game, your audience has a very specific taste what they want to read. And if you are making a game, the audience has a very specific amount of complexity they want. So when you're designing these things, again, this is for people. You are allowed, by the way, to write for yourself. Don't feel bad about that. But we're giving you advice here. I'm assuming that you want to put it out a little bit more than just I wrote stories for me and my friends on my Tumblr blog. We're assuming you want to do a little bit more than that. You don't have to be like a world-renowned author, but we're going off the idea that that's what you want to do. You want to push towards that direction. So you need to make sure that the reason your genre is kind of fixed is so you know what to develop. If you're writing military sci-fi, people really don't care about the food. That's not going to be a really big issue what's going on outside of the military rations. So if
it's like
it's like unless you're specifically focusing on that as a story mechanic, don't worry about it. Understand the scale and what you're trying to do with your story. There's a lot of the time where it's just like, I don't think anybody really like addresses it. And even in Star Trek, they have like, oh, we just sort of have like these replicators that make whatever food we want. It's not important. Focus on other things.
No, dude, it's literally like watching the Avengers movie and being like, how do they pay rent? It's like, look, that's not relevant.
That's not super important to what's going on here. You could, as long as it's obvious that you can hand wave it. As long as it's not something like, hey, no, everybody's poor. That's why it was so weird in Captain and Falcon and Winter Soldier.
I was just going to reference that, you piece of crap. I was just going to reference that. I was just going to reference that.
That's literally the thought.
It actually breaks the world because it was implied that Tony's paying for everything beforehand, which is a stupid retcon that sets up and makes everybody worse. Because they wanted to tell a specific story, and instead of telling the story that was set up for them, they beat it into place. Whereas with a lot of sci-fi stuff, if you know what your story is going to be, tell those stories like that in your setting. And I think we're on the topic of mixing sci-fi and fantasy. Did we talk about some fun topics and some genres that do that yet?
Yep.
We've talked about Star Wars a lot.
So Star Wars
is like picture of science fantasy.
Yes, but what about fantasy science? What about the other aspect? Where you go?
We talked about Eberron, and Eberron is kind of fantasy science fiction, wherein they like apply technology advancements to magic. And then of course there's things that are like post-apocalyptic things. And you could reference like the Dresden Files, which is magic in modern day Chicago. Which is kind of a neat thing that's right in the middle, not quite either one.
Yeah. We also have a lot of fantasy settings where a big part of a lot of fantasy settings is they've existed for a very long time. The ancient civilization fell. And usually that ancient civilization was some type of like super magic civilization. But sometimes they're just straight up a sci-fi civilization, or there's some type of weird magic tech civilization. And it gives you like this very interesting sort of flavor to your writing or to your stories, where there's like where you can have hard sci-fi in it, and it like makes sense, and then you throw magic in there and it kind of messes everything up in a very fun way, in a planned way, obviously, since you're writing
On
it.
that point, I want to bring up something that's going to be it's going to be a hot take for half the people here, but the other half the people are going to think I'm an idiot until it happens. I promise you right now, you're going to find out that Game of Thrones actually has like literally no magic, and that the White Walkers are all AIs. I promise that's going to happen because that's been hinted at.
You think so?
Yes, they're going to be nanomachines. I know that's what's going to happen.
Nanomachines.
Yes.
Hang Nah,
Because-
you got insider trading knowledge. What do you?
Well, yes and no. This has been a theory for about a decade. Every time Martin's been asked about it, he refuses to answer that question. But he will not shut up about everything else in the setting. He's even told us what the pussies of some characters smell like, but he won't talk to us about this theory.
Hey,
Are you serious?
Yes.
Yes.
yeah.
I mean, it's
True, you
George R. R.
got
Martin, so.
Good. Now he's the guy.
Hey,
I feel
man,
like
that was some vital information that we
Brothers.
needed to know.
He
okay?
wants to
brother.
describe the texture of a character's diarrhea, so yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No
Like 4
way,
pages.
did he really?
no.
Very
Yes,
How do
he
you
really
have
did.
road race that
Yeah,
was
for
that
like
long?
4 pages.
But
Wow.
he's the guy.
That's
He's the guy that
crazy.
I actually feel like also fell into the hole of like overdoing it with the world building and the historical lore and going tracing
no.
back 1,000.
No, he's got another
every
problem.
fan.
He's doing that to hide his issue. His real issue is
Right.
he's a cuck and he's not brave enough to end his story. Because
I
he
see-
knows that you have to end the
So
story in a
true.
way, and because that's always been his critique of Tolkien is it's so dumb, and I'm a big brain, college boy. I don't know what a horse looks like for the first 4 books, which is true, by the way. And I'm going to tell you
Nice.
people that I understand better about storytelling than this Professor Tolkien. He could not write a
Look,
story.
I-
What was Aragorn's tax policy? So I'm going to make my entire
Look.
story to answer that question. Because Aragorn should have been a real shitbag. Because everybody I know is shitbags. And I was born in California. How can you tell? And now he's at the point where he's like, well, hang on a second. I've only written shitbags. Everything I wanted to tell has been gone off the rails because I just followed the characters. And I have to go off on all these disparate trails. I have no way to
That's
pull it back thematically. I screwed myself. And then he had the plot line. I promise you, the major beats, except for Sansa getting the North freed from the last season of Game of Thrones, are all true. Bran becoming the High King was canon. Tyrion hanging out and becoming the Hand was canon. All the kings, losing. The way Cersei loses. All of that is going to be how it ends, except for like Jon Snow is probably going to still be alive and unified with Dany. Dany's going to go insane and kill everybody, so Jon has to kill her. All that's going to happen.
Nice.
And you're going to love it because the books were written that way. And George told them that, Dan and Dave. And what happened is they rushed the endings. So now George sees everybody fucking hates the endings he has planned. So George has like 3 books left to write, trying to figure out how do I get them to the point of the stories that everybody already said they hated that I told them I have to write towards. He ain't going to do
I
that.
don't know
No.
about that. I feel like at this point he's like
I have-
prolonging it to like
That's what I'm saying.
hopefully die
No,
before
no,
he
Yes.
gets to the,
I,
like.
He doesn't
I
want
have
to finish it. That's my
Right.
point.
But it's
Yeah.
still,
I have
yeah.
a completely different theory. I have a completely different theory about specifically how the books are going to end or the way that he had it planned out, but I don't want to totally go into detail with it. But I will say the fact that when we go into world building, to drag you kicking and screaming back on topic, I would say the way that Tolkien set up his worlds up was like, there's an established right and wrong, whether you want to call it Christian or not, there's good and there's bad. I feel like Martin also set up a world where literally like you don't even know who you're rooting for, and that makes it hard to establish who's a hero or who does what or why you care about this guy.
Purposefully.
And, like maybe that handicaps him also as far as establishing
Oh, for
you
sure.
know a
Oh, yeah.
a coherent ending that anyone will actually care to fucking read.
Yeah,
But
If
I-
everyone
everybody
is
sucks.
a dirty bag of asses, you don't
Right.
care about the story. Like at a certain point, you're just all dirty bag of assed out. Like you can only
Right, yeah,
accept
because-
so many dirty
because-
bags of asses before you're just like, well, this fucking sucks. All
It-
this sucks. I hate all these
stop-
people. I want everyone to lose.
And the
Right, and
people
it
you don't
stops
hate
being
are like so
story.
far removed from the main plot, they can't do fuck all about it.
Dude. Right.
Yeah.
It stops being a story where you actually are rooting for a main character. Like you're literally just exploring the world and seeing what dog shit bad things happen to people, and then kind of being like, all right, well, what's going on with this guy, or what's
Which
going
is
on?
funny. Which is
And
kind
it
of funny to think about because like historians like in the past like already figured out, hey, maybe we should like have the king or the emperor or whatever like actually seem like a cool dude, so that like it looks good, but also like
Sure.
it helps with reading the history when you're like, oh, this is a dude who's like doing
It's-
this and that. That's actually cool, and he's fighting this guy, and he's literally Satan incarnate. Like
Right. It's the way that, like, it's even like in American history, the way that basically you're taught about the Revolutionary War being like the
exactly,
British.
yeah.
So George Washington was so good, and so you build up a sense of pride in a given character. So
Right,
I feel like
yeah,
I-
because you get like also you get a couple things actually with that, because you also get like King George is basically usually treated like the devil in that type of sense, and then you also have like a Judas character with what's his face?
oh, fucking the guy
Benedict
whose
Arnold.
name was with
Well, yeah,
Uh,
Benedict Arnold
Arnold,
is
yeah,
literally
Benedict
evil,
Arnold.
and King George is double Satan, so it's okay. That's real facts.
Yeah,
Don't listen to
exactly.
people on the show; they're
I'll
idiots.
tell you, bloody.
I'm the only one who
I've been
knows.
doing
So true.
I've been doing some research.
So true.
There were some boys that did some real damage. Bloody John Bacon, actually. I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. It
What do
doesn't
you mean? The
matter.
Americans were perfect and did nothing
He
wrong.
did
What do you
everything
mean?
right. The British were dumb
No,
and
no,
lame
he
until
was-
World War II when we saved them.
Exactly.
Never-
So,
They were fine after.
so
They
on
were
that,
fine after.
yeah. So
God
on the
bless
point, like I was
later.
saying earlier, well, let's tie it back to the podcast. We're almost done, boys. So, with the idea of sci-fi and fantasy being so linked, I think that's important because George R. R. Martin, like I said, he wrote a lot of sci-fi stuff, and you're going to see that naturally bleed into it because Martin is one of the last people writing from the time when sci-fi and fantasy were basically the same. Conan fights an alien in one of his original stuff.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. He goes, he's old, dude. He's old.
Yeah, Conan stuff
Oh, I
is
didn't even
ancient.
mean that. I meant more the Conan fights an alien.
Oh,
That's
multiple
what I
times.
meant.
Conan has
Oh, yeah.
so much weird, cool stuff going on. I would
That
recommend
is awesome.
reading Conan.
So,
Oh,
think
I was
it's a-
gonna actually mention this
it's
at the
called-
beginning, but like,
one of the names of the aliens from
kind-
Lovecraft things. It's not a Shoggoth. It's another one of those things, like a thousand eyes on it.
oh,
It like sucks out your brain.
Argus?
Yogg-Sothoth. Yeah, Yogg-Sothoth shows
Argus.
up and Conan
Plus
just
it.
kills the shit out of it because he's Conan. That's just things he does. And like Lovecraft loved it because he thought it was funny. Because like, yeah, if anybody who could kill an unkillable god, it would be Conan. And him and he high-fived about it because he just could do that stuff back in the day. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of Jack Vance's stuff is just science and magic mixed with fantasy. At the same time, you have the Wizards of Mars. Like, besides a incredibly cool title, they sit there and they trap demons in their skulls to cast spells, and like that's awesome. And you wouldn't get that otherwise. And the way it's explained is as if it was a science. It's not one of those things where it's this weird, floofy mysticism that you'd expect. It's talked about as if it's a scientific thing. They go out and they find all the old demonology books from Earth back in the day, like the Lesser Key of Solomon, and they find the demon from the Lesser Key of Solomon, and they summon him just so they can torture him to get him to give them new spells. And it's like stuff like that. It's very scientific and methodical in the research. You'd probably really like Dying Earth a lot, Pag. You would get a kick out of some of the shenanigans they get into.
This really does sound great, actually. I kind of want to read it now.
I
It's
think Dying
also
Earth
where
might be the next thing on the
fantasy
fantasy
comes
for us the book club to read. It's another super foundational thing. I would argue Dying Earth is the most foundational book that nobody's read for modern fantasy because besides Tolkien, everybody rips off D&D, and the entirety of D&D's magic is just from Dying Earth, and like it was Gary's favorite fantasy world. To the point where, like, it's, Jack Vance and him would exchange letters all the time, and Gary really wanted to have Vance write for them. They just couldn't afford him, which sucks. Another one is Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Those stories are the entire reason we have the Thief and the Barbarian class. He wanted to call them Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, but because of copyright you couldn't. So we got Thief and Barbarian instead. Well, it would be Barbarian and Thief in that case. So just these things, like, that's why we have thieves in modern fantasy. All come from all the way back in these stories. And Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, I think, met Conan once, and then like they also fought an alien. They found a lightsaber type thing because this is before Star Wars. Like, they just found ray guns all the time and shot each other because it was just a thing that happened. I think the second or third module is Keep on the Barrier Peaks. Peak of the, something like that. I'm sorry, guys. My allergies are making me lose the idea. But it's the Barrier Peaks module.
It's okay.
The idea for that module, which is again first D&D stuff, the players go there and they find that there's some weird aliens hanging out nearby. And what happens is, it's these aliens are from a spaceship that crashed here 10,000 years ago, and all of a sudden the pods that had all the aliens collect from different planets exploded. So now you have to, with your swords, go in there and fight the robots and shit. It's really awesome. And
True.
I don't want to plug myself, but I do. Go watch my James Ward video. You can really see just how intertwined they were back then to when they were first coming out with Mothership Gamma. That they just literally spun the table around and let James run it. And they took characters from D&D into it. And they had like ray guns and all that stuff when they came back into the real world. It's really awesome. And you look at it, you're like, that's really interesting how they have the science in the middle of it. And World of Warcraft is so full of this. All the bastards have spaceships in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
I love anything.
Warcraft is really just also a sci-fi setting if you think about it,
It
or
really
science
is.
fantasy at least. Go on, Pops.
Anything
My bad.
you can establish that sounds like sci-fi, but it actually can be explained, even like in a totally different setting, like as a biological thing. I find that so fascinating. Like, obviously,
Pops,
it takes
there's
some
a
work.
book, I think it's called the
it
Dragonflight
really-
novels. You'd get a kick out of that. Every book opens with something like, I think that's what it's called. I gotta confirm the name. It opens with, Octeris 2244, 758 days of this year, and it's like a whole biological readout. And the premise is that it's a planet that was colonized by humans, but they had it set up as a world for like raising animals, and they genetically made dragons here because they thought it'd be cool. Then an alien race declared war on the humans and shot their ship down, and they forgot about it, but they still have dragon riders. So now there's these like dragon riders fighting each other for like control of these kingdoms, but it's an experiment that the aliens are running on the humans who crash landed here.
Anything with an extant scientific concept, and then also like a coherent biological justification for it, I'm all for it. That sounds good. What's it called?
I think it's called Dragonflight. Don't hold me to the name of that, but I can look it up for you after we go to the show.
It
Yeah,
sounds
if
like
it's not that, I'm going to burn your house down.
No, it sounds good, dude. Honestly, like I'll check that out. Honestly, go ahead.
I can't speak to how the high quality of that one is. I've not read that personally, but that I know that's again trying to tie your science fiction and your fantasy together. They're very closely linked. This isn't chocolate and vanilla. This is a sundae that you're taking scoops from. This is Neapolitan ice cream. You're meant to have all the flavors together typically. I personally like to try to keep my fantasy a bit more pulled away from my sci-fi in terms of like laser guns and all that, but I don't mind having a lot of the scientific aspects fully explored for whatever the time period should be and for the magic. And I think that you could really benefit from taking the character building ideas that you get a lot of fantasy authors and pulling that into sci-fi, and sci-fi authors giving like fantasy people a lot of the ideas with how do you explain a world and how do you get down to the nitty gritty with theming your actual settings.
Yeah, I got you. Because actually, I tried to read Crazy Rich Asians, and I got so bored that I started rereading for like the dozenth time a certain book that I enjoy more than that one that has a lot of racially motivated violence. And so,
if you're part of the server, you guys know that Pops is a big fan of One Fist, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. He's just completely down with the race wars in that book.
Good. It's you can tell.
It's a message you can't understand in this 3-hour video essay.
Yeah.
Shut up.
So if you've ever, I do submit cute little ditties that I write that are about 4 pages long and describe literally nothing that's important. But I swear, if enough of you start joining the server and putting pressure on me, I will start actually trying to write a book that is a book rather than one scene.
Pops, if you don't write a book, I'm gonna pull your fingernails out one by one.
Brother, believe me, I'm already doing research on basically,
There you go.
literally a historical thing that happened where a certain group of people was essentially disowned by the government that they had a contract with. So if you
The Armenian genocide?
I'm being
You
heavily
know how
influenced
little
by
that narrows it
No.
down.
If I told you what it was, I would dox myself. But
Oh, fair.
eventually, yes, I wanted.
Thinking it was going to be like some of those guys who after the Civil War went down to South America and tried to set up stuff down there. Like, what are they
Yes,
called?
Brazil.
Filibusters?
Brazil still has parades. Brazil still has parades where they still wear a certain symbol.
Oh,
And, oh yeah, oh yes. Brazil was the first country in the New World to outlaw slavery. Which, if you want to have that in your fantasy setting, it's good. But Pag also has that in his sci-fi setting. So let's hear him talk about that.
What, outlawing slavery?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, interesting segue. Well,
do you not have slavery outlawed?
I mean, in my setting,
I don't mean to
it is
put you on the
outlawed
spot.
by the main
But,
group of humans. Yeah.
no, dude,
but
it's
you know,
one thing. No. Anyway, to talk to your fucking sci-fi trilogy about the homestead, right?
mhm.
So one thing that I love that you did that also played into what I said before is the way that when Marissa landed. No spoilers for anyone who hasn't read. When she landed on the planet with the Rakers,
Don't do that to me.
she ran into a bunch of people who had no idea that there was a world beyond themselves. Like sticks and stones, they had no idea what guns were or
Mhm.
woven cloth or anything. And I feel like establishing that as a world building dynamic, the fact that there were these people who literally didn't know what was going on in the external setting. Like there was whole empires, rebellions, everything. And
Yeah,
yet
it's a
we
little bit
have this
reversed.
contained setting.
I was
And
just about to
it
say
really
that.
helps.
It's a reverse of what you used to, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, because the main character is explaining things, what's going on to these benighted people on this planet. Yeah, that's true.
I think book one was probably my favorite.
Book one is also my favorite, Pops. I like all of them, but because my favorite character, Laska, doesn't get to shine till book 3, really. But book 1 is still my favorite. On that point, I want to say that's a great example. This is why I'm pumping Pag's books. I'll be completely honest. There are several other friends of people I know who have projects they've been working on. I'm not pumping them as hard as Pag's things, not just because he's on the podcast, but because he's actually put out stuff that I think is worth quality. I'm not going to say that he's going to be the next Tolkien, but I think that you can very easily read his books and actually enjoy a lot of them. Because I've read so
I'll
much.
say he's going to be the next Tolkien.
I don't think so.
I got issues.
He's not Catholic enough to be Tolkien.
That's true.
The font bothers me.
Yeah, the Rakers
The what
bother
bothers you?
Pops.
I don't like the font, bro. It's
You don't
easy
like
to
the
read.
font.
It's you'll be. I swear to God, like you'll be turning the pages like it ain't nothing. Like literally, like it
Building
invested. But the font.
Invest in font.
I mean, I can differentiate the font between we can have an episode where we talk about Kindle Direct Publishing it sometime, kid. But I can adjust the font so that
We talk
it's
about the nuances
different
of kerning.
in the physical novel. I can't adjust the kerning so much. I still have to choose a specific font. But yeah, there is.
We should talk about how Pag's book is just ruined because he just chose the worst font. It's truly
I
unfortunate.
really did choose the worst font. Fucking
I thought you were
Arial,
going to talk
bro.
about the Rakers, because that I know that pissed you off something fierce. Back before you two were
could go
friends,
on and
you
on about the fucking.
Oh my god. Pops is an animal guy. And I introduce a fucking carnivorous species in my first book. And I'm all right, this is just a plot device for the book. It's just a thing that's there. It's spooky, it lives outside. And Pops is like, what the fuck do they eat?
Stop. Because first of all, you describe them as like akin basically to a mountain lion. And then you say that they have fucking like scales on their backs and shit like beetles. Like they're not feline. They're not from the earth, and you describe them as felines. And like I'm going.
They kind of look feline,
They're not feline. They act like adjacent to felines. But what do felines eat? They got an all meat diet. Like cats literally meat.
Actually, they don't follow the exact specifications of it.
I'm right. It's okay. I'm
right. Felines. So they're not really felines.
It's a term of description. Like if I describe a starship as being like hawk-like, it's just kind of evocative.
No.
If it doesn't look like a hawk tag, then it's not hawk-like. Okay.
Hawks eat things. What do spaceships eat?
The spaceships.
No, it's become a sorry
If there's
because
small
this
enough
is
to eat
obvious.
people,
Shut up.
checkmate.
Yes, shut the fuck up. Because this is obviously like way off topic, but it's become a meme. If you guys would join the server and listen to me rant and rave, you'd understand. But it's an autistic thing that I have about world building because when I write, I very, very, very like I describe like every fucking animal and tree and everything as like kind of like with human terms. Like I kind of what's the word? Personification? Like I do that shit to such an extent that like I realize it and I start kicking myself. And so when I hear something like, "Oh, there's this animal species that hunts people," and I'm like, "Well, why do the people have shields made out of the animal then? Like, do they hunt each other? Like, how does either one survive?" So I just had something just cracked in my brain, and I don't want to bombard the fucking podcast with it because it's not on topic.
You know what? We'll
That's just my
show about Pag's book, and we'll rip into it. I promise you.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's actually the worst piece of fiction ever.
I promise you all that we will have. Well, one of the upcoming book clubs, I will buy a lucky member of the server a copy of the book, and everybody will be required to read it. Before we go, though, Garbled said he had something he wanted to talk about. I assume it is his homosexual love for me, but we'll let him go.
I mean, almost certainly.
I swear to God, keep that stuff under wraps. We're not supposed to be doing that when we're on the podcast.
But the main thing I wanted to go over was just even with like what Top was talking about is try to keep the scale of what you're trying to do manageable and don't extend too far. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the magic stuff about an hour ago. Of it's a very complicated system, but also don't introduce like multiverses or time travel and stuff like that unless you need to, because it asks a lot of really awkward questions. Whereas if you have stuff like Lord of the Rings, you never have to wonder if just like, but what happens if Gandalf time travels to Godzilla's place, brings him back, and also has a gun? It's like, no, you just have to worry about the setting itself and its defined rules, and it also keeps things simple. Don't overcomplicate stuff.
Mention Godzilla, you'll summon him. You'll summon Rune.
Kid, please. I know this. I know this is my first time. But please, it was an innocent mistake. Please don't kick me for that one.
You'll get a fate worse than kicking. Okay, that would be a mercy.
You'll have him for 30 minutes tell you how he doesn't care about the show anymore, but he's gonna write 500 episodes on how much he hates Godzilla.
Once
just
again,
the main thing was
get the fucking lore.
Yep.
Understand where you want your story to begin and end, and don't try to overextend it and add in things that don't matter.
Yeah,
keep it small. Keep it palatable.
You have to. It's exactly what I said before. You take into account the events of the story and to what scale they affect, like kind of the overall universe. And you can make a great story regardless of whether it's very, very contained or whether it's like, blowing up the Death Star.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, don't. I think you specifically mentioned multiverse and time travel. Those two, like,
those
can
ones
be
bother
fun
me.
for like a single event, but like, they kind of blow themselves up
when it comes to
because like the multiverse just leads to and here's this character, but X, and then time travel will, I think, almost inevitably. I don't think I've seen a story where like there's not going to be at least one, but occasionally several different time travel paradoxes that are like. I wonder how that works.
It's called world breaking, right?
Yeah. I guess that is
I don't like it. Like it's a cool concept, but I feel like nobody can do it right anymore. Like I can't imagine how to.
You have to do it very sparingly, and don't have a time travel promise like we have to go back to the past to change the future, because you either have to go to a different dimension, with the reason being if you went back and prevented the crisis, then the crisis shouldn't happen in the first place.
Well,
and
that's where you get into like the different paradoxes where you get like, there's Bootstrap, there's I can't list off all of them.
Time travel stories need to be about time travel. If you introduce time travel into any other story, it's immediately going to like obliterate your narrative, because it's like, wait, they could just time travel. I mean, look look at the Avengers, like the second Endgame
Endgame.
or whatever the hell it was called.
Yeah,
Endgame. There you go. The second
Infinity
War
one,
ruined the
you
world
know,
building.
whatever the fuck. Yeah, they destroyed their world building because why the fuck can't someone else figure out how to go back in time? If Tony
Well,
can
not-
just do
not-
this, there's no reason that someone
No,
else.
my
The
man-
info would still
Well,
be
no,
even
no, no,
stored
no,
in
it's actually
Jarvis, who
worse.
is still around.
No, hang
It's
on,
worse than that,
because
actually, because the tech is still around because Cap uses it at the end of the movie. They don't like
Doesn't
destroy
even matter.
it.
Yeah.
that
Cap
doesn't
just
even
uses
matter.
it.
Because
Yeah, so
before
nothing
that,
matters anymore.
Yes.
Yeah,
because
that's the
before
Yeah,
that, it
nothing
was like
matters.
it was like, why didn't you just send time back? Like, you could have gone farther back in time. Like, they had enough fuel to send less people farther enough back that, like, even less crises could have been averted.
Even worse, because
Yeah, why not?
they established that they could go back in time to get PIM particles. Why didn't they go into the future 10 minutes or a few hours before the warp and go to
Like,
PIM
it
and
made
say,
no sense.
"Hey,
How-
we need your PIM
They only went
particles"?
they only went like a few years back, and it's like, how many more like things you could have prevented?
Yeah, the Avengers canonically allowed the Holocaust to happen.
Yep.
On God.
Look,
He sat there and watched and said, "This is going to be good for the future."
yeah,
You really did.
look,
And that's why you
Cap,
don't introduce
Because,
that into your world building.
Look, Cap wanted
Yeah.
to bang Peggy, and Tony wanted
No,
his
dude.
daughter. Okay,
It's like,
so
Are you gonna-
I mean, who's the real winners here?
are you going to save the Jews? And he's like, no, I don't think I will.
Yeah, if you're going back in time, are you going to kickstart this movie? No, I don't think I will.
Are you going to save us from Hitler? Are you?
No. Save you?
No.
He's trying to save you.
Oh man, yeah. Anyway, yeah.
But this is
I don't
all in
wanna-
service
All right.
to
So
say when
I
you
think
when you're building your fantasy
Yeah.
or your sci-fi world, keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it with these really
Honestly,
aggrandizing
yes,
plots.
yes.
Keep it simple and then build up the blocks to that if that's something you really want to do, but ensure that you have a good foundation first. And also don't just make all of your stakes go out the window once you start doing that.
your setting will naturally expand into something that feels like it's been lived in as you start adding more stories to it, as you start telling more stories, because you'll be able to
Yeah.
explore more details of it in depth. Don't worry about getting it all
And you
fleshed out now. I'll just give you guys a
You
hint right
don't-
now because I know they're not watching this damn show because they suck. My players don't know that for my Saturday game that we introduced, me and my dad who's running it, introduced as the Maleficarum, who's a group of evil wizards who are currently setting up a bunch of plots. They don't even have fucking names as of yet, but we hinted at them. There's 7 of them out there, plus they have a leader, and the players been working towards that. Last night, me and my dad spent about 4 hours coming up with them, all their plots, their reasons for being evil, all their backstories. So now that the entire Saturday crew, because they finally got to the point where they need to start fighting these guys and like dealing with them, it's all set up for them. Who's a subversive? Who actually is in it for themselves? Who was forced into this? All of that.
Yep. And everyone, it was Father's Day. What, yesterday? So I hope
Sunday.
everybody reach out to Dad, give him a word of advice, or give him a little fucking love. If you got a dad, you know how it.
And speaking
Everyone
of,
came with a dad. Whether it's in your life is a different story.
speaking of, I think this is a great time to end the show. Nebula and me are going to be streaming soon. Nebula actually is probably turning his stream on now. I will get a link and
Yeah.
immediately be able to send it over. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for people to stop discussing Cap going back and discussing the Holocaust.
Exactly.
No, that needs to be discussed again.
All right.
He
And
needs-
with
he
that,
needs
chat,
to
I'm
get
going to
better.
post things here. I'm going to allow everybody else in this call to leave themselves out. So whenever you guys are done talking, if you want to leave the call, then that's great. Me and Nebula are going to sit here and we'll transition immediately into Baldur's Gate 3 streaming hours.
Oh, bald
Just want to
sex.
say thank you
I
for
got
having me.
Yes.
It was great to be here.
Thank you, Garble. To catch you later, my friend.
Marbled.
Have
I
a
gotta-
good
Yep. And I gotta
Alright.
drag Des somewhere else. We gotta do.
Yeah,
we
I'm
gotta
trying to
finish.
figure out where you're gonna drag me.
Yeah.
Take
care.
care.
We're gonna go to Starseed.
Starseed works too.
Okay.
No, I'm,
Yeah, I don't know
All right.
where in Star
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye,
I will
guys.
be.
See you. Deus Vult.
All right.
All right,
stream
fellas.
it.
Good
See
night. I think this was a fun one.
To us.
Yep. And
All right.
stream
Later,
is
man. Peace.
starting. Yep. See you.
All right. So, Nebula here. Thank you for joining us.
It's started.
Yep. Go
Yep.
ahead and
I just
get-
hit start.
Yep, go ahead and grab me a link, my friend, and I'm going to throw it here in the chat.
Just posted in Video Creators.
Beautiful. Chat, I hope to see you all over there shortly.
No.
Thank you for joining us in my stream, and